Well, like he said, my name is Traever Guingrich. I'm the pastor at Grace Chapel Reformed Baptist Church, about 15 minutes northeast of Birmingham. We're only about 20 minutes from Kurt's church. We're glad to have them as another Reformed Baptist church in the area. We're a 1689 confessional Reformed Baptist church, just like many of you here. I have way too much material, I'll admit that. I'm just going to go as fast as I can, not as fast, as far as I can in my first lecture. I am very honored to be here. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me. Church history has always been one of my favorite subjects, especially when it comes to the Puritans and the early particular Baptist, neither of which I get to talk about today, because the title of my lecture is The Anabaptists, the Junk Drawer of the Reformation. I am equally as fervorous about them as well. I know that title initially sounds pejorative, but I think as I explain what it means, you'll see that it's not meant derogatorily. So my task today and tomorrow is to cover the Anabaptist, in whom I happen to have a vested interest because, as Mark said, one of the reasons he asked me to handle them is because I was born, raised in, and was a voluntary member of an Anabaptist church up until the age of 28. And like any other peculiar group, there's no better education about them than having lived among them and been one by conviction. The best known Anabaptist groups in America today are the Mennonites, the Amish, and the Hutterites. I was not a part of any of those. I was part of what was called the Apostolic Christian Church. I don't want to spend too much time telling stories about what my church life was like. I could go on and on about that, but I do want to describe a few things so that you get a glimpse of what the experience was like, at least in my sect. All the church leaders were laymen. They were distinctly against any kind of training from the outside or even internally. In fact, when a minister got up to preach, he might not even know he was preaching that morning, but he simply would open the Bible at random, and whatever his eyes first fell upon would be his text. So every sermon's text is completely unplanned, and its content is extemporaneously preached. It's to be under the influence of the Holy Spirit. It's kind of mystical that way. The men and women would sit on separate sides of the congregation. There's no jewelry allowed, not even wedding rings, though that is somewhat changing in a few churches as of very recently. The men would wear dark suits with a white shirt and a dark tie. The ties were always a must. I once was visited in my home by a brother who admonished me because my thrift store suits were not conforming enough to what was expected. The women would always wear their hair up, usually in a bun. They wear head coverings, a smaller one for daily use, and then kind of a bigger, longer one for the church service. Facial hair in sports were banned outright. If you did either one, you couldn't be baptized. Again, that facial hair aspect is starting to change in a few churches. Marriage is said to be by faith, which meant no dating at all. Marriage proposals were actually submitted through the elders. So I would call my elder, who called her, and asked her if she was willing to receive a proposal for consideration. And then that answer was given in reverse. She'd call her elder, who called my elder, who called me. So I got a call from my elder informing me that I was getting married. My wife and I did not date before getting married, and we paid all the expected consequences of that, but that's another story for another day. Some would get engaged. This doesn't happen as often, but some would get engaged after a single 15-minute conversation. Some weren't even sure of the name of the person, or they would get the name, they wouldn't, I don't know who that is, and they'd have to find out, and they'd marry him when they got that proposal. But they generally marry young. Marriage itself is very highly esteemed in the culture. If you were 25 and single, something had gone wrong. You were over the hill. Engagements are very short, usually about 3 months. Weddings are large. We had, I think, 1,500 people at our wedding. Greeting with a holy kiss is still practiced. Only men with men and women with women. So every time you see someone in church, or if you go to their home, you would say greetings and you would kiss them on the lips. At my extended family get-togethers, all my uncles, you'll see them shake hands. They'll say greetings or farewell, whichever, and they kiss, and they still do this. Please never quote me on this out of context, but I have literally kissed hundreds of men. Their church discipline is perhaps their grossest abuse. If you know about the Anabaptists historically, this probably won't surprise you. Excommunication is practiced with the ban, or what's called shunning. the ban, where the person that is excommunicated, nobody's allowed to even eat with them. And sadly, excommunication is exercised even if the person is voluntarily coming in confession and repentance for the sin. It's still, they're excommunicated to keep the church pure of sorts. They generally save it for serious sins, but restoration to fellowship and membership was always very, very rare. They would automatically remove your membership if you married anyone that was not a member of the church, so you weren't allowed to do that. Communion was practiced once a year, and it was forbidden to be taken in any other church. In my wife's church growing up, they did not have communion for years on end at all because one of the other church members, and I think there was about 10 or 12 people that went there, one of the other church members was upset that my now mother-in-law had bangs and their family had a TV down in their basement. So because of that discord, there was no communion for years. Anabaptists have historically been against most new forms of technology. You see that in the Amish and the older Mennonites. In my church, it was never banned outright, but it was discouraged. It could be preached against. You would be looked down upon if you had too much of it. You weren't allowed to serve in the church if you had some technologies in your home. Ministers would never have TVs. It was extremely rare. Many don't have the internet. Many still don't have TVs. Some of them do now. Phones were, when they first came about, they were against phones. And I don't mean cell phones. I mean literally telephones that were on your wall in your house. I remember in my grandparents' farmhouse, I used to always go play with their old rotary hand crank. You hold it to your ear and talk into the... They still had that on their wall. They had an updated rotary phone, but that was still up on their wall. When cars were becoming widespread, they were against them. They were even in the past against their members using lightning rods on their houses because they thought it displayed a lack of faith. I could go on and on. My old church, like many other Anabaptist sects, has not been able to totally avoid the influence of the modern age and American evangelicalism, though they have tried to shield their members from both of those. So some of those more ridiculous items I've just listed have begun to fade in some of the local churches, but that has been in recent years. I'm sure actually some of them will watch this or see it online, and I admit some of them have changed a bit, but this was what it was like when I was growing up in it. In a way, I will say I am appreciative of my upbringing. It's made me far more appreciative of biblical doctrine and biblical church polity, and especially of the gospel. It's sort of like a man who's lost in the desert comes out and he's way more appreciative of drinking fountains and indoor plumbing. They do not take that for granted anymore, and that's sort of the way I feel, because a man in the desert goes without it for so long. Now, if upon hearing that list, significant portions of it do not align with what you know about Anabaptists, then don't be surprised. For us, for instance, facial hair was banned. Even stubble was seen as being rebellious. Amish, on the other hand, have traditionally required facial hair, without mustaches, but facial hair, at least of their married men. So there's this fascinating intersection of the cultures between Anabaptist and Eastern European immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it influenced their perspectives on the acceptability of mustaches because of the association with the military over in Europe and that conflicting with the Anabaptist doctrine of pacifism. Very fascinating stuff, but we don't have time for that. But here's the point that I was getting at, contrasting my upbringing with the Amish regarding facial hair. Each Anabaptist group tends to have their own set of idiosyncratic traditions. There are similarities, but the real unifying characteristic across Anabaptist groups is not identical traditions and practice. It's idiosyncratic traditionalism. That is the first characteristic of what it means to be Anabaptist. If you were taking notes, I'll try and highlight the things that are worth writing down. Idiosyncratic traditionalism is a strong characteristic of Anabaptists. There are odd practices among each group without much connection to either the Catholic, the universal church, or even to Scripture itself. But whatever it is that they develop, whatever idiosyncratic tradition they invent, they will hold to it with a tenacity to the point where to do otherwise is considered rebellion against church authority. They are very Pharisaical this way. Many Anabaptist churches are drowning their people in Phariseeism. The traditions they make up get elevated to the same level as God's law, and they are enforced by the leaders of the church as if they are equal to God's law. And rebellion against the teaching authority of the church is a significant taboo. Doing so is usually a sign that you've lost your salvation, or you're not saved. That's another defining characteristic of Anabaptism. The surety that salvation can be lost. That is a characteristic of Anabaptism. The surety that salvation can be lost. I'll talk more about their doctrine probably tomorrow, but they are fiercely Arminian. They never abandoned late medieval, synergistic, semi-Pelagian soteriology. They wouldn't use the Arminian label for themselves. Arminians rarely do, but they would heartily agree with all 5 points of Arminianism. And the one point that they would hold to the strongest and care the most about is definitely that you can lose your salvation. That is it for them. In fact, if anyone holds to the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints, they think that they're a Calvinist. So even those one-pointer traditionalist Southern Baptists are Calvinists to them. They would hate that idea, but in the Anabaptist mind, they're Calvinists. And the Anabaptists generally see that doctrine at the root of evangelicalism's error. They would see it as the big reason that churches are so weak today. They perceive it all as easy believism and carnal Christianity stemming from the fact that everybody's out there thinking that they can't lose their salvation, so they can do whatever they want. The odd thing is their pervasive Arminianism is why you see traditionalist Southern Baptists attempting to find unity with the Anabaptist in history rather than the genuine Baptist roots among the Puritans and the founders of the SBC who were blatantly Calvinistic, as we even heard of the Georgia Baptists. Now, before I go on into the real heart of this lecture, I want to sort of describe what I'm trying to convey. I don't just want to give a historical rundown of significant figures and events, though some of that needs to be included, and we'll go over it, because that shapes their history, and their history has shaped their modern iterations. But anybody can read those in detail on their own. I want to do more analysis and diagnosis along with that historical rundown. I'll tell you now that nearly everything that I say, both good and bad, can be fairly responded with, well, not all Anabaptists, which is true, but we have to speak in general themes. And I have to constantly say, some Anabaptists were this way, and I'll try and distinguish wherever I can. What I hope to leave you with is an understanding of the Anabaptist ethos, to get a feel of the spirit of the Anabaptists, what they are like, to have a feel for Anabaptism as a movement. Because no two groups of them are the same. But there are similar teachings and mentalities and tendencies and characteristics, some of which I've already described, and you'll see those across Anabaptist groups. But we will start today with a bit of history, and that goes back to their arrival on the scene during the Reformation. That's where my title comes in, of the Anabaptists, the junk drawer of the Reformation. And that initially sounds pejorative. I'm not calling them junk. It sounds like that, but I am simply acknowledging a historical reality. Everyone has that one drawer in their kitchen or their office that is filled with odds and ends. It's usually really messy. Some of the stuff in it is useful. Some of it is garbage that could easily be thrown out if anyone paid attention to what was in there. It's a hodgepodge of clutter whose only unifying element is that there's no good alternative place to put any of it. So it all gets dumped in that junk drawer. That's what the Anabaptist title was in the 16th century. The category is not as broad now, but back then, most of it just didn't, it was just the ones that didn't fit in any other category, and they were just called the Anabaptists. They definitely weren't Roman Catholic, they weren't Protestant, they weren't Reformed, and they weren't Lutheran. They were just the category for all the miscellaneous sects, radicals, revolutionaries, mystics, spiritualists, apocalyptic preachers, and frankly, lunatics that cropped up in Europe during the confusion that naturally emerged from a rigid and stratified religious, socioeconomic world that had been turned on its head by the combined forces of the Reformation and the Renaissance. I apologize for that run-on sentence there, but that's the best definition I can come up with, and I'm going to repeat it slowly. The Anabaptists were just a category for all the miscellaneous sects, radicals, revolutionaries, mystics, spiritualists, apocalyptic preachers, and lunatics that cropped up in Europe during the confusion that naturally emerged from a rigid and stratified religious, socio-economic world that had been turned on its head by the combined forces of the Renaissance and the Reformation. I'm going to try and fill that out a bit. It's a very long definition. If we were to use the term reformers in the broadest sense possible, as in all those that departed the old order of Roman Catholicism in the 16th century, then the Anabaptists were the epitome of reformers who had zeal without knowledge. The Anabaptists are not our spiritual forefathers. So why talk about the Anabaptists at a Baptist Distinctives Conference? After all, as I hope you all know by now, us Baptists did not come from the Anabaptists. There's no organic connection whatsoever. The Baptists came from the particular Baptist Puritans who were separatists from the all-too-slow-to-reform Anglican Church in England under Queen Elizabeth, then King James, then King Charles I. They developed in the early 1500s until they finally established a distinctly Baptist identity under John Spilsbury and others in the 1530s. They were Puritan, they were Reformed, they were confessional, they were Calvinist, they were covenantal, they were congregational, and they were Credo Baptist. Exactly what we still are right now. The only commonality that the Anabaptists shared with them was the Credo Baptist part. So I say again, the Anabaptists are not our spiritual forefathers. Although, as a persecuted religious minority, as we both were, neither they nor we wanted the state dictating to the church allowable beliefs and practices. But even there, it would not be accurate to say that the Baptists and the Anabaptists shared the same view of the state or the civil realm in general. There's similarities, but they don't share the same view. So again, why talk about them here? Well, in spite of those historical facts about Baptists, we still get lumped together with the Anabaptist. People assume that the Baptist faith was the flower that bloomed from the seed of the Anabaptists, that the Anabaptists sort of disappeared or developed into Baptists. That is not true. The Anabaptists were winnowed or diminished into a more identifiable group. Their most radical factions, theologically, philosophically, civilly, politically, that kind of thing, those most radical factions disappeared, but the Anabaptists never went away. So we talk about them as Baptists so that we know why they are not us and we are not them in doctrine, in practice, or in history. The second reason to talk about them is because some of the characteristics of the Anabaptists have become increasingly evident among modern-day evangelical believers, such as radical independence, especially from the institutional church. People today have far less problem throwing out or at least completely ignoring centuries of historic creeds, confessions, historical theology, and orthopraxy. Churches are trying to reinvent the wheel on statements of faith, on church polity, on the mission of the church, on church membership, on worship, nearly everything. They just sort of get together and make it up. They're they're detached from history. They're detached from the small c Catholic Church. Because of the dearth of historical confessionism and because of the rampant apostasy of the mainline churches, in some legitimate ways, we could say that the Anabaptists have promulgated their ethos more pervasively into American Christianity than perhaps any other Reformation group. I don't think they did that themselves. They don't have much contact with the evangelical world, but still, evangelicalism has been largely Anabaptized, if we could say that. And lastly, one final reason we talk about the Anabaptists is for the simple fact that they are terribly interesting. And there is no shame in wallowing in the pure enjoyment of church history. And if there were, then my MP3 player would be nearly empty most days. Also, let me acknowledge there is a problem when it comes to studying the Anabaptists that you will see in the sources if you start to look at it. Many historians who spend significant time on them look at the Anabaptists with rose-colored glasses. They are overly favorable because of the persecution against them. So they're underdogs. So they're overly nice to them. They create this unrealistic picture of being overly sympathetic and then glossing over many of the most significant errors, or they just kind of ignore them or pretend like every one of those errors was just an aberration. Other historians simply highlight the craziest of the bunch and then brush past the rest too quickly. They snipe at them, which is admittedly very easy to do. The Anabaptists produced a lot of low-hanging fruit for which to criticize them, but a select few of them are worthy of our respect. Today, we're going to talk about the best of the best. Tomorrow morning, we're going to talk about the worst of the worst. If you are reading something and the Anabaptists come off looking pretty good, then know there's probably a need for harsher judgment. If you are reading something and not one of them seems like a genuine brother in Christ seeking truth, then there's probably a need for more generous analysis. So if you are prompted to read more about them in the future, please be aware of that reality in the secondary sources. I'll try to maintain a proper balance as I deal with them. I feel this innate tug to defend them in weird ways because of my upbringing, yet knowing what I know about their doctrine and practice, both today and in the past 500 years, I have a near endless list of harsh criticism and frustrations with them. I'll be honest, I'd say that my punitive posture towards them outweighs my defensive posture, and I think that's justified, as I will try to show you. Now, with all that being said, let's return to the 16th century to get our minds around them even more, around these original Anabaptists. Remember that junk drawer idea. Anabaptists ranged from naive biblicists, again, I don't mean that negatively, just a little bit naive. So it ranged from that to complete and utter kooks, insane people. And it included everything in between. And there's no clear delineations between who's what. There's bleed over all the way across. They could not be fairly called Protestant or Roman Catholic, obviously. And make no mistake, that title, Anabaptist, was a slanderous label. It was meant to fearmonger. We'll talk about why it acquired that reputation probably tomorrow morning. It was almost like calling someone a Branch Davidian. If you know the story of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in the 90s. Or a Jonestownian, somebody from Jonestown, like saying that they drank the Kool-Aid. And this is because of the Munster Rebellion and the Peasants' War and political anarchy that became associated with them. We're going to get to it. By the way, the People's Temple, led by Jim Jones, that eventually culminated in the mass murder and suicide of like 900 people, they claimed that they were practicing apostolic socialism. And they had Marxist leanings. Well, some of the Anabaptist sects likewise practiced forms of apostolic socialism, Christian socialism, and they had these proto-Marxist leanings. They implemented Marxism, more or less, a proto-Marxism, when they got the chance. And one of their stories, the one of Munster, rivals Jonestown in its level of shock and scandal. I'd say it blows Jonestown out of the water. You have to come back tomorrow to hear that. But the Anabaptist socialism and the proto-Marxism that they held to was all claimed to be apostolic. In fact, that desire to be apostolic is one of the defining characteristics as well. They want to be apostolic. They have this mindset of returning to the simplicity of doctrine and life that they perceive in the apostolic era. And in some cases, they want to return to the socialistic communities that they think existed in the early churches. The Amish are still basically socialistic. The Hutterites are essentially communistic. I've seen videos where the families come in and get their daily food ration from the guy in charge of it. Daily food rations for them. Anabaptists have a golden age perception of the early church. You can see it in that name of the church that I grew up in, Apostolic Christian Church. We're the originals. That's what they're claiming. That's what they're trying to get back to. And you would hear them articulate this idea of a simple faith when it came to arguing against doctrines that they don't agree with. They claim they just want a simple faith. Just a simple faith. And they accuse you of complicating things with overly deep or defined doctrine, which they do not like. at all. I told a guy once that I wanted to get into the doctrinal meat referring to Hebrews. And he says, well, don't you know, if you get into the meat, you might get into the bone. And I didn't know what that meant. He never explained it to me, but I perceived it was supposed to be bad. I have yet to reach the bone that is so detrimental in doctrine. So it's fair to say that Anabaptists are apostolic primitivists. They are trying to recover the primitive church. So that's another characteristic, apostolic primitivist. But that name, Anabaptist, was used slanderously and polemically. If there was a group that was apart from the establishment that someone didn't agree with, they might get called an Anabaptist to try and attack them. When the particular Baptist arose in England, there were pamphlets published against them, calling them Anabaptists, and implying that they would do to England what the Anabaptists had done in Munster. They'll try to overthrow the king and take over England. The Anabaptists had a history of that. So when the particular Baptists wrote their first confession, they titled it The Confession of Faith of Those Churches Which Are Commonly, Though Falsely, Called Anabaptists. Likewise, I think not many people know this. I was talking to Brandon about this morning. The first edition of the Institutes, Calvin had to say that he and the other Reformed, the Huguenots in France, were not Anabaptists. Even he was accused of it. And obviously that had nothing to do with credo baptism. It had to do with rebellion and anarchy and upsetting the establishment, all of which are glamorized in our modern entertainment culture and on our college campuses, but were both despised and genuinely feared in the Reformation era. So the accusation of Anabaptist was used to incite opposition to some Reformed-minded groups. The Roman Catholic Church used them as the example of the logical conclusion of the Reformation. They're saying, see, that's what's going to happen. You leave the Roman Catholic Church, you're all going to be there eventually. That's the logical conclusion. The Anabaptists almost ruined the Reformation. It's fair to say that. Medieval Roman Catholic sacramentalism was like heroin. If an addict stops it cold turkey, it can actually be dangerous. It's somewhat counterintuitive, but you have to wean them off of it over time. That's what Europe was like. A heroin addict, except they were addicted to Roman Catholic sacramentalism. Europe was like that with bad religion. Unfortunately, it could not be immediately reformed in every dimension. It couldn't be. Some things just had to take longer. It had to be brought along. They had to be weaned into the truth. The sacraments, for instance, didn't get fully reformed until like 100 years after the 95 Theses. Luther partially reformed the Lord's Supper and baptism and church polity. Got rid of the Pope, got rid of transubstantiation, didn't fully reform it, got rid of elements of baptism that were wrong. The Continental Reformed and Presbyterian came along, they reformed it a little bit more. And the particular Baptist then came in and finished the job. I would argue that the particular Baptist got those three right. Lord's Supper, baptism, church polity. They finally got it fully reformed 100 years after Luther. And their understanding consists of consistently fencing both baptism and the Lord's Supper for believers only, and then considering them both as a means of grace. That consistent fencing became a Baptist distinctive. We treat the Lord's Supper and baptism for believers only because that's consistent. From Luther to the Reformed Baptist, they got closer and closer to a biblical understanding. This is where I find a bit of sympathy for the Anabaptist. If we're being generous, we might say that they were a little bit ahead of their time. It's a very nice way of saying elements of their teaching were a little bit ahead of their time. But some of what they were demanding, it was centered on biblical reform, but they wanted it without hesitation, to which they deserve some credit. They wanted religious liberty immediately, and that was just never going to happen that quickly. It wasn't going to happen. They believed in the separation of church and state, but not in the secular sense. They didn't want a secular society. They just wanted liberty for themselves because they were a persecuted minority. They wanted to be left alone. Unfortunately, in isolated pockets where Anabaptists had the majority, they were not so permissive in granting religious freedom themselves. Confessional Presbyterians took a while to abandon their idea of a state church. It wasn't until they saw that sacralism was not going to pass muster in the newly democratic-minded America that they finally abandoned this idea. I know we can find significant flaws like that in every group of reformers, but the Anabaptists are simply more complicated and more flawed. Generally speaking, in my opinion, they are one of the embarrassing aspects of the entire era. Some of them were not as bad as the rest, but overall, they're still trending pretty negative. I saw one historian raise the question. He said, were they heretics, fanatics, saints? And I believe the answer has to be heretics? Yes, some of them. Fanatics? Yes, some of them. Saints? Yes, some of them. And that answer, honestly, has not changed in 500 years, though it's clear that the proportions between those three divisions has changed a little bit. There are less fanatics now. That element did not endure, thankfully. They tended to get themselves killed. Remember, the Anabaptists were not Protestant. They wanted radical change in both a good sense and a bad sense. But in seeking that change, it is helpful to think of them as non-magisterial reformers. They sought no partnership with the secular authority like the princes, the city council, the magistrates. They weren't trying to use them or their power and say, hey, let's get this done. And that tended to push them to the fringes of society even more. This is a generalization, but the magisterial reformers were thinking in terms of reforming the institutional church and entire nations. The Anabaptists were thinking in terms of reforming each person or each individual church, being allowed to do what they please. Not necessarily because they didn't want large-scale reform, but because they had no confidence in the Christians that they saw in Europe or the reformers or the civil authorities. So they're looking very narrow, very small. The magisterial reformers are looking big picture. The Anabaptists had a narrower view focused just on them and their small band of followers. Even though they deserve some credit, we have to acknowledge that many of them were unhinged and detached from historical orthodoxy, so for which they deserve scorn. And because of that detachment, they fell into severe doctrinal error, almost willy-nilly. Or it might be better to say that they never abandoned the error of much of medieval theology, particularly the soteriology. They never actually abandoned that. They just wanted a more holy church to accompany it. I've used this illustration on several occasions, and it seems to help people grasp how this worked. All too often, the Reformation is looked at like it's this linear scale where the Roman Catholic Church is here, and then the Lutherans reformed it a little bit, and then the Continental Reformed made a little bit more progress, and then further down the line, again, away from Roman Catholicism, the Puritans reformed it even more, and I've almost spoken of it in those terms when I talk about it. And to a degree, that's true. And then they think, well, then the Anabaptists came along on this linear scale. They leapfrogged them all. They're all the way over here on the far right, and they made the most radical reform. They're the absolute farthest away from the Roman Catholic Church, and that's how they think of it. That's not accurate. It's more like a horseshoe, like this. It's a horseshoe where, yes, the Lutherans reformed away from Roman Catholicism. They make their way up the horseshoe, and then, yes, the Continental Reform made a little bit more progress, and yes, the Puritans came along and improved even more. But the Anabaptists actually came back around and actually started mimicking some of the Roman Catholics' same errors. They traveled the furthest in terms of reform, but they didn't always head the right direction. So in the end, they wound up closer to Roman Catholicism than the Reformed or the Puritans, even though they supposedly reformed further. It's like a football player, a running back who runs, sees that he's blocked, and then he runs backwards 10 yards to try and avoid his tacklers and waves and wags, and in the end, he makes it 1 yard past the line of scrimmage. That's what it's kind of like. They weren't the most progressive reformers. They were a bit regressive from their fellow reformers. They paralleled Roman Catholicism in odd ways. They have a similar level of unbiblical, idiosyncratic traditionalism as Roman Catholicism, but without the Pope, without the sacramental system. But both are still inherently Pharisaical. Let me try and explain this. Roman Catholicism created this empty black box. They took this empty black box and they filled it up over time with all kinds of man-made and heretical inventions. Then they got out their label maker and they slapped a nice big label on the front that said tradition. This is our big box of tradition. They didn't seek to defend any of those made-up traditions that are in the box. They just defended the concept of traditions in general. And then they enforced tradition as a concept with this authoritarian power of the church, reinforcing this tradition. So that's, you've got this box of tradition, you've got the power of the church behind it, enforcing it all. And then they can add and take away from that box as they please. They can just open up that lid and throw in a little bit of papal infallibility because that's a pretty useful tradition for a church that has power. People seem to like the Virgin Mary, so let's open up that lid. Let's add to that tradition a bit. Let's drop in a set of Marian dogmas. Now that's part of tradition. They never have to show that there's any historical doctrine in the Bible that defends that because it's tradition. And look here in the Bible where it says that tradition is spoken of positively. Look here in the Bible where you see that. So submit to the tradition. Or we'll use the power of the keys to excommunicate you. And oh, by the way, there's no salvation outside the church. So submit. See how this concept of traditions can be twisted to become traditionalism. We have no problem with traditions. We have a problem with traditionalism, authoritarian traditionalism. See how powerful that can be for an authoritarian church. They can do whatever they want. They can create a rule that you have to have pink houses, and they can enforce it by the power of the keys. Well, the Anabaptists came along, and they like that black box, but they don't like what's in it. So they take it to the trash can, and they just dump out that box of traditions. They just dump it out. We want no connection to the institutional church. But this box, this is a pretty nice box. I like this box. They can put anything in this box. And they appear to have a biblical defense for anything that they put in it. Because look at that label. It says tradition. Who could be against tradition? Christianity has tradition. Look where the Bible speaks positively about tradition. So they kept that box and they invented new traditions, idiosyncratic traditions. Now you have to have a beard. Or maybe you cannot have a beard. But suddenly it's law because it's tradition. Or you have to marry in our church only. Or you have to dress this way. No, you can't wear a colored shirt. No, you can't wear jeans to a singing. That's worldly. No, you can't play sports. That leads to pride. No, you can't use modern technology. That's what the world does. No, wedding dresses have to look this way. They have to be this length. You have to pray this way. Use these words. You have to live in our community. You have to wear these kind of dresses. You have to have this view of the civil magistrate. It's tradition. You can't have buttons on your clothes. That's vain adornment. What are you doing? You can't have pictures of yourselves. That's the same as a graven image. What are you doing? And the list goes on, and you have to submit to it because these are our traditions. Look at the label on the box. And don't you see here on the Bible where it talks about tradition? It's positive. It talks about traditions. It's good. You aren't being rebellious, are you? Do the elders need to exercise the power of the keys and excommunicate you? Do you need to get banned from eating with us even? You know there's no salvation outside the church, don't you? Why won't you submit to the traditions? It's fundamentally the same concept of both traditionalism and church authority. It's just got a different mask. Yes, the Anabaptists were less formalized when they mimicked that Roman Catholic air this way, but they never abandoned the medieval air. I remember when I was in one of Dr. James Renahan classes at seminary, and he quoted and adamantly agreed with John Owen's comment that Christian liberty was the second principle of the Reformation. At first glance, the Anabaptists are all about Christian liberty. But in the end, they implemented a mutant version of it that ironically paralleled the Roman Catholic Church that they detested so strongly. They are no less dogmatic about their traditions that they've invented ex nihilo than the Roman Catholicism, the Roman Church is about theirs. They're no less dogmatic. And that has become another defining characteristic of the Anabaptist. Not just any idiosyncratic traditionalism, but authoritarian traditionalism. Authoritarian traditionalism. Their idea of Christian liberty has not been applied to the individual Christian conscience. It was meant by the Reformers to restrain church authorities from imposing unbiblical worship practices and man-made laws. The Anabaptists have ignored that restraint and imposed their own version of traditionalism. I think one of the best reasons the early Anabaptists may look unrecognizable in the face of the modern image we have of the Amish or the older order Mennonites, is those traditions took time to develop. But the trajectory for what the Anabaptists had become was set 500 years ago. It was almost inevitable, based on what they did then, when their mentality and their priorities were established. And that's what, if you look at their history, you see that. You see where they're bound to lead based on what they did then. But this was only a portion of the early Anabaptists. So that is what I want to start covering right now. I want you to see how diverse they were initially, how that junk drawer label applies. I thought we would get to this sooner, but nevertheless, here we are. The Anabaptists were mainly in the Swiss cantons. They were in Germany. They were in Central and Eastern Europe a little bit. Later, Anabaptism arose in the Netherlands because some traveled there for refuge. They had more Christian liberty there, or at least church liberty. Some of the first true Anabaptists were actually under Zwingli in Zurich in the mid-1520s, and they were known as the Swiss Brethren, though there were some other fanatical Anabaptists in Germany that Luther had to deal with a little bit before them, but these guys are sort of the first true Anabaptists. The Swiss Brethren had three main figures: Felix Manz, Conrad Grebel, and George Blaurock. I have the most sympathy with these guys. Of all the Anabaptists, I have the most sympathy with these guys. They were in Zurich. They were reforming right along with Zwingli and the rest of Zurich, so they're presumably improving fairly quickly. They've come out of Roman Catholicism's era. They're starting to go back to the Bible. They're starting to reform. So you think, okay, these guys are making progress. And their reform started fairly simply. These guys were the Biblicist reformers, the Biblicist Anabaptists. They were practicing sola scriptura, just like Zwingli had taught them, which was, he said, if the New Testament doesn't teach it, we shouldn't practice it. Simple principle. So with Zwingli, they get rid of church images, they get rid of the church organ, they get things of that nature. They start to just strip out all this stuff. But after a few years, baptism came up. And when they raised that question of why are we practicing infant baptism if it's clearly not in the New Testament, then it became an issue. And it was initially received by Zwingli somewhat positively. He didn't just react super negatively at first. He seemed to somewhat be open to discussion. But the tradition was too strong. Infant baptism was tied to becoming a citizen of the state. You're kind of circumventing secular authorities if you don't practice infant baptism, which automatically makes them think, okay, these guys, they want anarchy, almost. Eventually, Zwingli opposes them, and then he's basically uncomfortable with the speed at which they were seeking to abandon the practice. That seemed to be the trigger that made him be like, all right, I'm not with you. I'm against you. So there were public disputations. Zwingli argues against them. The city council sides with Zwingli against the Swiss Brethren. But they start practicing credo baptism anyway. They're not doing immersion yet, but adult. They think of it in terms of adult baptism, which is considered by Zwingli as Anabaptism, meaning baptism again, or rebaptism. That's what Ana means, again baptism. Hence that name, Anabaptist. So Zwingli asked the city, town council, or whatever to pass ordinances against them, eventually even authorizing execution for convicted Anabaptists. At least that was permissible. It wasn't required, but it could go that far. It was probably just to drive them out or get them to stop, but once the Anabaptists stuck to their convictions, then some of these executions had to actually be done. And this, of course, is a consequence of sacralism, having a state church. So then and there, the violent and suppression and persecution of Anabaptism begun. It kind of started in Germany with these other guys, but it's just a little bit different brand. So Conrad Grebel left to preach in the surrounding areas. He got arrested, but escaped after a few months. However, soon after that, he got the plague and he died in 1526. Felix Manz was the first one martyred in January 1527. So this all happened fairly quickly. He received what was sadistically called a third baptism, which was being drowned in the river. They tied his hands together behind his knees, and then they'd stick a pole between him so that he could be held under the water, and then they could retrieve his body when he was done dying, while his brother and his mother looked on from the shore. That same day, George Blaurock was severely beaten and permanently expelled from Zurich. I think this is because Manz had a daughter. He refused to get baptized or something. I'm not super clear on why one is banished and one is killed. But there's some leeway with the secular authorities on how to handle it. So Blaurock's beaten. He's permanently expelled from Zurich. He was rearrested and rebanished multiple times in the following months. In 1529, so there's a few years where we're not real sure what he's doing, but he became a pastor in 1529 of a church whose previous pastor had been burned at the stake. Sadly, later that year, Blaurock, too, was arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake by Roman Catholic authorities. It's hard to feel anything but sympathy for these three Swiss brethren. They were different. They were different from a lot of the other Anabaptists, but also from the Reformers. There's no real great heresy on record from any of them. It's hard not to feel sympathy for them. How useful to the church would they have been had they been given the freedom to mature in their reforming faith? If Zwingli had taken them under his wing and defended them and given them some liberty and taught them, would they have developed into Reformed Baptists? They could have, maybe. Would a Puritan-like movement have begun in Zurich and spread throughout Europe? Possibly. How grounded were they in the rest of the Reformed faith that they had been learning? They were in process of it. Did they abandon it or react against it because it was the faith of their persecutors? How strongly did they teach justification by faith alone? Why didn't that teaching come to undergird Anabaptist doctrine like it did with the Protestants? These are all historical, hypothetical questions I would love to have answered. The strange thing to imagine is that in eternity, when we get to ask them, we may very well find them side by side with their killers. Could happen. Restored in perfect union. These three men also seem to have association with another important early Anabaptist, Michael Sattler. He was a former monk who had briefly visited Zurich after he left his German monastery in 1525. Again, very short period of time. Left in 1525, and these guys were dead mostly by 1526, 1527. But he is best known, Michael Sattler is best known for writing the Schleitenheim Confession in 1527. It's one of the very few confessional documents of the Anabaptists. We're going to talk about it tomorrow. It's not actually a full confession. We're going to talk about why that is. His life of being an Anabaptist was short, though. He left his monastery to come to Zurich in 1525, right as the Swiss brethren are kind of coming online as Anabaptists. But he got expelled from there, and then by 1527, just 2 short years later, he too was captured by Roman Catholic authorities in Austria. At his trial, he was asked to be shown his error from the scriptures. Reasonable, you would think. He was told the hangman would debate with him. Some of the soldiers guarding him mocked him while they were waiting for his verdict to be returned from the judges. And it was returned in about an hour and a half, and it read this. This is the verdict. Michael Sattler shall be committed to the executioner. The later shall take him to the square, and there first cut out his tongue. Then forge him fast to a wagon, and there with glowing iron tongs twice tear pieces from his body. Then on the way to the site of the execution, 5 times more as above, and then burn his body to powder as an arch heretic. The Roman Catholic Church did not mess around when it came to their executions. They exemplify horrific barbarity. There's a low-budget movie called The Radicals, which tells the story about Sattler and his wife, the early Anabaptists. If you're interested in watching it, I can send you a link. It's not super easy to find, but it's called The Radicals. So throughout this drawn-out execution where he's walking and being tortured and cut and torn with burning red tongs, Sattler reportedly preached to the watching crowds, even after having part of his tongue cut out. He asked the crowd to intercede for his judges. He asked the crowd to intercede for the judges who were there, present, they were watching this. He addressed them directly, too. They tied him to a ladder to throw him into the fire, and just before he prayed, he said, Almighty, eternal God, thou art the way and the truth. Because I have not been shown to be in error, I will, with thy help on this day, testify to the truth and seal it with my blood. As he was burned, he prayed and he sang in the midst of the fire. And then after some time, the ropes that were binding his hands burned through, and he was able to raise his hands and give that famous two-finger sign of promise. And he finally prayed, Father, I commend my spirit into thy hands. 2 days later, his wife was drowned. Almost a compassionate execution in light of what they were capable of doing. So you can see that narrow window of time where all of this is happening. These men were the earliest recognized Anabaptists, starting in about 1525, and they were all dead in just a few short years. These guys are the best of the best. They're not indicative of the movement as a whole. They're the best of the best. In fact, if you study the early Anabaptists, you'll see a lot of death dates in those the latter half of the 1520s. A lot of them got killed. It's not even known what Sattler's beliefs were on the actual gospel. I'm not super sure where he was at. He was more of a holiness reformer. I don't know how to feel about him. I want to like him. But I'm not sure what he actually, I don't know how far he got away from his Roman Catholic roots. He barely had any time to get out of it. He wanted morality in the church. But morality doesn't save us. So again, like others, the specifics of his doctrine in regards to justification and salvation remain kind of ambiguous. And we're forced to leave it as an open question. His religious background and trial, they were all Roman Catholic. And though he denied enough of Roman Catholicism to be killed, he denied enough of transubstantiation or the authority of the Pope or whatever it may be, it's not clear if he reformed the heart of the heir on the gospel. We're not real sure. I want to think that he did, but he maybe didn't. By the way, the Roman Catholic Church was responsible for 85% of Anabaptist executions. And the total number of Anabaptist deaths was dwarfed by the number who were killed from the Reformed. Absolutely dwarfed. But in terms of percentages, they were probably a little bit closer. So in many cases, the Anabaptists were technically charged with and executed for denying many of the same Roman Catholic doctrines that the Protestants were, but without being Protestant. And the fact that they were executed by so-called third baptism of drowning shows that there was this genuine hatred and this sadistic attitude towards them. It's almost like boiling a goat in its mother's milk. You're not supposed to do that. There's just something really twisted about it. And that's sort of what they're doing. At their executions, there was not exactly this begrudging sadness that these guys had to be done away with. They hated him. They hated him. We might also note that since their third baptism drowned them, it killed them, it shows that everyone really knew that baptizo meant to immerse. They weren't sprinkling Anabaptists to death at their third baptism. And don't get the impression that the Reformed were out hunting them down. Of all the groups, the Reformed killed them the least. Anabaptists could often survive fine, keeping a low profile in most cities. Their presence was known, but when a popular leader or a rabble-rouser showed up, they would often be challenged to a public disputation and then banished. They'd be kicked out. Hans Denk, for example, was this mystical Anabaptist. He denied justification by faith alone. He became a universalist. He had this public disputation with Martin Bucer in Strasbourg before being banished. He wasn't killed. He was just banished. Before his death from poor health, he was taken in Basel by Oecolampadius, the scholarly reformer, who visited him multiple times and interacted with him on doctrine. Another Anabaptist, Pilgrim Marpeck, was likewise challenged and banished, but otherwise treated fairly. He requested and was granted additional time to get his house in order before he left the city. And then he was replaced in his civil role by two suspected Anabaptists who were tolerated because they were just more private in their convictions. So you can see that the Reformed weren't out headhunting Anabaptists. They seemed to be open to frequent disputations with them, and they recognized the confusion of the period. So don't think it's just these big, bully Reformed beaten up on. I mean, it is a little bit. But there's some understanding there. Even after Marpeck left Reformed Strasbourg, he lived his final 12 years of life peacefully in Lutheran Augsburg, where he even worked for the city as a civil engineer, and they knew he was an Anabaptist. The authorities were kind of annoyed by his Anabaptist views, but they never really did anything about it. That sort of restraint was not practiced by the Roman Catholic Church, as we have heard. They were already well accustomed to the murder of the saints. They had renewed the Swabian League, who was this band of hundreds of armed horsemen. They were authorized to go kill Anabaptists without trial, just find them and kill them. And that's what they did. They killed men, women, and children even. But remember, being victimized or abused does not by default make you a good guy. I wish our culture understood this. Amen. Jews have for years been persecuted and martyred. You look at their religious resume, it's horrific what's happened to them. But they hate Jesus Christ. They're not good guys. Anabaptists aren't good guys just because they stand up for their convictions. Convictions are great. Being steadfast is great. But if you're doing it without the truth, you are a fool. And that's often what happened. Being steadfast is great. But if you're doing that by wild teaching, justification by faith alone is not true, that you're justified by faith plus works, you're still a heretic. You might be an oppressed heretic because you deny some element of the Roman Catholic Church, but you're still a heretic. Being a martyr does not save you. Faith in Christ alone saves you. And that's really the question of where they were with that. Did they get there? So those are the best of the best. Tomorrow morning we're going to talk about the worst of the worst. I hope that wasn't too fast. But you can see this picture of them is incomplete. It's going to get very ugly. In fact, I'm going to give the disclaimer now. The information you're going to hear tomorrow might not be appropriate for children. It gets explicit, both sexually and violently. And to get a full picture of that, we've got to talk about those details. So that's where we'll go tomorrow. Hope to see you then. And I hope that is a good beginning to what the Anabaptists were like.
And then 1 Peter chapter 2, was meditating on this as I was thinking about your first message, Traever. It says in verse 11, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or governors, or them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do well. For so it is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, not having your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honor all, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only the good and gentle, also the froward. For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it if, when you be buffeted for your faults, you shall take it patiently?" Thinking about what you were sharing, Traever, there, about those that died patiently, and that there have been many who have died patiently for wrong causes. And yet God says, what glory is it if you're buffeted for your faults? "But if when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. For even hereunto were you called, because Christ suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps, who did no sin, no guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judges righteously, who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we being dead to sins should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were as sheep going astray, but now are returned to the shepherd and bishop of your soul. May God add a blessing to the reading of his word. Well, we're delighted to have Pastor Traever back with us again for our second installment on the Anabaptists. We got the best of the best, and now we're ready for the worst of the worst. I think we're ready. We'll see. Glad to hear you, brother.
Yeah, I hope you were here yesterday to get to hear about the yesterday when we covered the good guys. But you need to buckle up because things get a little bit crazy when we talk about the worst of the worst. The hardest part of my preparation was to stop reading the history. And there's more of it than I realized that you need, that it just needs more attention. So, talked about those good guys yesterday, from the early Swiss Brethren, who were basically a flash in the pan. They were there as Anabaptists and then gone in just a few years because they were killed. But a movement continued under the same name of the Swiss Brethren. Other Anabaptists, however, outside of the Swiss Brethren, were violent revolutionaries who genuinely deserved death. And some were simply heretical nuts. These branches seemed to be of a different spirit than the Swiss Anabaptists, or the Swiss Brethren. They were a different quality of men, we would say. Some of these bad guys, I'll have to just briefly mention, and then you can read about them in your free time if you feel like it. Melchior Hoffman was one of the apocalyptic type preachers whose ideas about the end coming soon had an impact on the Munster Rebellion, which we're going to cover. For some reason, Melchior Hoffman seemed to have a strained relationship with the Swiss Brethren. We're not real sure why, but it might have been just because he was a bit too nutty for him. He was convinced that he was the new Elijah or a reincarnation of Elijah, something along those lines. He was also one of the first Anabaptists to hold to a blatantly aberrant Christology. This was the idea of Jesus having a celestial flesh. Or they said he did not take his human flesh from Mary. He had a celestial flesh, not a human flesh, something along those lines. It was a little bit mystical. Sort of a revival of the Gnostic Docetism, which claimed that Jesus only appeared or seemed to be human. 1 John writes against this idea quite a bit. Menno Simons actually picked this up as well, which is kind of surprising because he's closer to Orthodox. And he would say that Jesus passed through Mary like water through a reed. That was the imagery that he used when talking about celestial flesh. We'll talk about Simons more in a bit. If you get a chance, read about Balthasar Hubmaier, Hans Hut, Wilhelm Reublin, and Jacob Ammon. Ammon is actually a later Anabaptist. He didn't come along until like the late 17th, early 18th century. But he's significant because he's the one for whom the Amish are named. Came from Jacob Ammon. He split off from the Mennonites in the 1690s over what we would today consider pretty trivial matters. It's going to sound silly to us, but he had created some controversy because he had instituted foot washing in his church. He was pushing for a uniformity of dress. That still happens among the Amish. And he started practicing communion twice a year instead of the normal once a year. He had also excommunicated some of his church members who were unwilling to say that it was wrong to attend a service at the state church. He excommunicated them for that. But the main issue with his fellow Mennonites was that they were too slow to agree with him on the details of how to practice the shunning of excommunicated people. They didn't even disagree with his practice of shunning. They did that too, but just they disagreed, or they wanted more time to think about the details of how they would practice that. You see that idiosyncratic traditionalism cropping up that I talked about yesterday. They wanted some more time to discuss this with the churches. Ammon wasn't okay with that, and he excommunicated these other leaders, which he actually had no authority to do, but he just pronounced it. So this, of course, created a division. He later excommunicated himself because he thought he acted too rashly once he thought about it, though he still thought he had the right position, but this Amish Mennonite divide that he created never really healed, and it persists today. This highlights another historic Anabaptist characteristic, and that is extreme sectarianism. They already are a minority group. They're very small, but that does not prevent them from dividing over ridiculous things, ultimately. And then their factions that they create will factionalize. And then those factionalized factions will factionalize further. I saw this growing up as well in my Anabaptist church. They split in the early 20th century over facial hair. They had a church split over facial hair. One Hungarian immigrant retells his account of coming over to the States and having to shave his mustache in order to be accepted in the church. Then once he grew it back, he was excommunicated. The church would not even allow him to keep working as a carpenter for another member of the church. Even though he was poor and he asked to remain employed to feed his kids, they said no. His wife then had a baby, and the stress from this excommunication caused her difficulty in nursing. And they wouldn't allow members of their church to sell the family milk to feed the baby. You can see the authoritarian, idiosyncratic traditionalism rearing its ugly head there, and it leads to absurd divisiveness and sectarianism. The church literally split over the right to have a mustache. The church split again in the 1930s over the use of the German language. So the German church was started, which split again over other minor issues. And then those groups would split again to the point where the churches became just individual families meeting in living rooms, who of course were not allowed to marry anyone outside of their church, but that was only their family. It was all their relatives. So those groups tended to die out. The latest split just happened recently in the past few years because there was a growing heresy that was spreading unhindered for years. And this was all completely predictable. You can see their divisive nature. There's a real hardness among them. Don't get me wrong when I say that. They can be very kind and generous people, but they can also be very stubborn, and obstinacy and unreasonable inflexibility does not always come with an antagonistic face. Take this for what it's worth, but many Anabaptists have Swiss-German heritage, and they have largely remained a rural, agrarian people living insular lives intentionally separated from outsiders. And as one having multiple family lines with that background, and having been one myself, and having been surrounded with them my whole life, I can confidently say they can be a stubborn and hard-hearted, hard-headed people. They just are. They simply are not easily convinced of much. Even in the face of opposing evidence, they're not easily convinced of anything, and that is a recipe for the preservation of error. It really is. They rarely recanted in the Reformation, and they rarely recant today. They're just not bothered by not fitting in. Another guy I want to talk about, Jacob Hutter. He's worth mentioning because he founded the Hutterites, which was one of the more enduring Anabaptist groups that has survived up until the present day. And because he seems to have been influenced by the Moravians. He had spent some time in Moravia. I would love to see some research into the influence of the Moravians on the Anabaptists, because I remember studying them and I was just struck by the blatant similarities with my own experience. One thing about the Hutterites, that Jacob Hutter founded is they reflect the socialistic tendencies of the Anabaptist communities. The Hutterites had and still have this communal sharing of goods. I talked about yesterday how you can find videos of them going and getting their daily food ration. So it's really a communal, communistic type of a community. So Jacob Hutter and his wife were captured by Roman Catholic authorities. He was tortured and burned at the stake. His wife escaped while pregnant, but 2 years later she was arrested again and drowned. Hans Dank is another one. He's worth mentioning because he was one of these heretical spiritualist type Anabaptist. He denied justification by faith alone, and then he became a universalist. Yet he somehow remained an Anabaptist, remained with the Anabaptist groups. He was baptized by Balthasar Hubmaier. He was even allowed to lead the group of Anabaptists at Augsburg. When he was put on trial and then banished by Lutheran authorities, he was asked to present a confession of faith. And you can actually go and find it and read it online, and it's hard to tell what exactly he's saying or what he believes, or even if he believes that he believes. He was just kind of a disaster. So Hans Dank is one of these, he's a disaster. Some Anabaptists were rationalistic. They became rationalists, which led to them denying the Trinity or becoming Socinian. There was one Anabaptist man who survived the Munster Rebellion. Then he went and he joined the Mennonites, and then he left the Mennonites and started his own group called the Adamites that denied the Trinity, denied the deity of Christ, along with denying infant baptism. But what really gave Anabaptists their reputation was their fanaticism and their apocalyptic doomsday preaching that became so rampant. One segment of Anabaptists was very much the Reformation version of the crazy guy standing on the corner with a sign screaming that the end is near, the end is near. Many in that day, including Luther, thought the end was near. We cannot overemphasize how much it felt like the world was being turned upside down during the Reformation. And even scarier than the apocalyptic preaching of the Anabaptists was that they were trying to back up their prophetic claims by claiming actual revelation, divine revelation from God. They were sort of a proto-Pentecostal group this way. There is no surer sign of an untrustworthy teacher than a claim to receive special revelation from God. The principle of sola scriptura, seen in those earliest Swiss brethren, did not endure well as an Anabaptist doctrine or practice, unfortunately. A distinct mysticism set in that is still noticeably present today. Even though the apocalyptic Pentecostal inclination of the Anabaptists didn't really last past the 16th century, that mysticism did somehow. We see this claim to immediate divine revelation in the Zwickau prophets, who were teaching the impending apocalypse in the early 1520s, so very early on, very soon after the 95 Theses, the early 1520s. These spiritualist, mystic-type Anabaptists would accuse those that held to sola scriptura of being ministers of the dead letter, so that they had this very low view of Scripture. Obviously, they technically did not rebaptize one another, but they did deny infant baptism, so they are in principle Anabaptist. And in them, you see more of that proto-communist mentality. They stirred up class warfare. They preached this class warfare in the area. The feudal system that was in place was, of course, unjust, and it denied men some of their fundamental human rights. But these prophets, they very much advanced in Germany the idea of a proletariat working class being oppressed by the bourgeoisie upper class. Luther, who seeing this happen desperately, did not want the Reformation to transform into a political, civil revolution. So he opposed these guys. He referred to them as Schwärmei, enthusiasts. But despite his efforts, the preaching of the Zwickau prophets had an influence on men like Thomas Munster. Munster is the town, Munster is the man. Don't get those two confused. It had an influence on Munster and the Peasants' War that came about in the mid-1520s. So those prophets are there in the years before. They preach this apocalyptic stuff, this communistic stuff, and in the 1520s, the peasants revolt. They start a war. Thomas Munster was one of the worst in the Radical Reformation. Some argue he wasn't a genuine Anabaptist, but he had positive interaction with them, and he rejected infant baptism. And he likewise had these socialistic tendencies like many of the Anabaptists. I think he qualifies. Though he did apply it more to the civil realm, and the other peaceful Anabaptists kind of seemed content to apply socialistic ideas just to their communities that they created. Munster was a mystic spiritualist, and he was deposed in Germany for his violent radicalism and anti-clericalism. He advocated the use of the sword, so he was not a pacifist. In fact, he had a standing army. And he eventually used that to become a leader within the Peasants' War. To give you a clue of how bad he was, take a look at 2 Corinthians 3:6 says, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And he claimed that meant that because Christians now have the Holy Spirit, they no longer even needed the Bible. That's the letter. It kills. But now you have the Spirit. It gives life. Remember that idea of ministers of the dead letter, this low view of Scripture. So Munster basically rejected the Bible for direct experience of the Holy Spirit. To him, it was the mere letter, paper and ink. He used to say, Luther, Bible, babble, bubble, to kind of mock him, mock the ideas. And Luther responded by telling Munster, I wouldn't believe you if you swallowed the Holy Spirit, feathers and all. Luther also sided against the peasants in the war that they started in 1524-25. There's not really a good side and a bad side to the Peasants' War. Like I said, the peasants were genuinely, unjustly, unfairly oppressed by the feudal system, by the princes and the landowners. The inherent civil freedoms we are accustomed to today was not acknowledged. They were not acknowledged back then. And some of the demands of the peasants were not radical by today's standards or by any, you could say, unbiased sense of justice, but they were radical in terms of their historical context, and they were ultimately completely unrealistic. And the peasants' violence and destructive rampage was neither justifiable nor biblical, because that's basically what happened. Again, remember, with these peasants, being oppressed or abused does not make you a good guy. It doesn't give you license to do violence yourself. Luther did criticize the injustices imposed on the peasants, but he was not at all about the upheaval of the social structure that they were advocating. Eventually, he wrote against them, says, against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants. That's a classic Luther title, very hyperbolic. So this called for the suppression of their revolt. Luther even went about touring southern Saxony in an attempt to dissuade the rebels from action, but to no avail, and he later criticized the ruling class for their merciless suppression of that insurrection. Some claimed his writing was sort of the cause of that violent suppression, but it was already happening by the time that he wrote it. Munster and the peasants, Munster had the peasants, he joined them, and he had them convinced, even up until the day of their destruction, that Christ would intervene for their victory. Philip of Hesse, one of the princes, had a hillside of cannons pointed at their stronghold, and Munster told the peasants with him that he would catch their cannonballs in his sleeves and hurl them back at them. And he probably didn't mean that literally, but still, that's quite a statement when you consider that they're just a bunch of farmhands up against a professional army. And it gives you an idea of what this guy was like. So around 5,000 to 6,000 peasants were killed that day. Hess's army only lost like a dozen men. And Munster was found hiding in a cellar. He was captured, forced to confess, and beheaded. And then he became this proletariat hero of communism years later, which, if you ignore the religious aspects, it's somewhat legit to consider him like that. Some progressives have attempted to turn him and some of these other Anabaptists like him into like Che Guevara-like characters, but all they're really doing is co-opting their defiance against the establishment to support their own Marxist leanings. This social religious radicalism was linked to the Anabaptist in the mid-1520s Peasants' War, but it was the events of Munster, 10 years later, that solidified in the public conscience the real danger that the Anabaptists proposed, or that they posed to society. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say Munster is, without a doubt, the single craziest story in church history. It's more insane than all the defenestrations combined, all the people being thrown out of windows. There's a podcast called Hardcore History by a guy named Dan Carlin who covered this story in an episode titled Prophets of Doom. It's over 4 hours long, but I promise you it is worth every minute. It's the most detailed account I have ever heard. I beg you to listen to it if you get a chance. Let me know if you want a link to it. I can send it to you. Carlin is secular, so he doesn't really understand religious expression, and his worldview can't really handle it appropriately, but he does a great job recounting the raw data of the sources. His analysis is like, okay, maybe, but the raw data is it's very, very comprehensive. It's great. James White also covers the Munster Rebellion pretty well also. We could easily fill the rest of this day just covering what happened there. Seriously, but I only have time for a few highlights, so I'm going to give you maybe the fastest rundown of the Munster Rebellion. If even half of these reports are true, I mean, these are coming from the reports, even if half of them were true, it would still be off the charts insane. So between 1532, 1535, in that time frame, for various reasons, political, geographical reasons, this city of Munster, it's technically Roman Catholic, but it's actually religiously diverse. This city of Munster became a hotbed for radical Anabaptism of the worst sort. There were Anabaptists supposedly prophesying of the impending judgment day in those years, with Munster being spoken of as the epicenter of Christ's return, the New Jerusalem. Munster is the place where Christ is coming. There was a guy named Bernard Rothman. He was an Anabaptist leader there who continually stirred up this radical reform in the city. And he also held to that heretical celestial flesh false teaching. And he had an ally on the city council named Bernard Knipperdoling. So Rothman and Knipperdoling are kind of the first two guys there. And these two Bernards keep the city on this radical edge ready to explode. And they're sending out Anabaptist literature, and they're making these prophecies, and they're printing them, and they're sending it out to the regions, and Anabaptists are kind of getting worked up and drawn to the city, and it's just ready to explode. And the explosion was triggered by the arrival of two Johns, or Jans. It looks like Jan in English. So these two Johns, John of Leyden, who came in 1533. He was this charismatic, good-looking preacher. He had been becoming increasingly Anabaptist, increasingly apocalyptic, increasingly communistic. And he, too, saw Munster as the site of Christ's second coming, any day now. And following John of Leyden to Munster was John Mathis, or sometimes pronounced Matthias. I'm just going to say John Mathis, often Jan Mathis. He looked like a prophet. This guy was bald. He had a big beard. He dressed in all black. He had this wife 20 years younger than him that dressed in all white, so they stick out. They're these charismatic people. And they're sending out this literature. It's being printed. It's in the surrounding regions. It drew in more and more Anabaptists and radicals, on top of the fact that they're converting people within the city to Anabaptism. And this convergence of fanatical Anabaptists Anabaptist descending on Munster, what happened was the population demographics changed the power dynamics within the city, and the Anabaptists started an insurrection. They totally took control of the city. Communism began being not only preached, but enforced now. Those Anabaptists who were previously pushed to the outer boundaries of society or had to hide in the shadows were suddenly emboldened by a new sense of power. And the apocalyptic millennialism mentality naturally turned oppressive and violent. To those outside the city, this looks like the Peasants' War 2.0. Like, oh no, here it comes again. It's happening again. But now it's centered on this, really, it's a well-defended city. And it's totally controlled by Anabaptist lunatics with their horde of absolutely unwavering followers. You need to have a sense of what type of leadership was being exercised by these men. They were basically strutting around like they're in constant direct conversation with God, like literally speaking to God, receiving words, and then implementing it. And it's unquestioned. And surprise, surprise, all God's messages seem to give them absolute authority and very specific directions that just so happen to be right in line with whatever they wanted to happen. Matthes, after he gets there, tells everybody they need to kill everyone in the city who's not an Anabaptist. But then he's convinced by Nipperdalling not to kill them, let's just exile them. So one morning at sunrise, in the dead of winter, they go door to door armed with weapons and they kick out all the Roman Catholics. And they're not allowed to take any of their stuff with them. Just the clothes on your back, get out. The Lutherans are given the option to convert, and if they convert, they get to keep their stuff. So they kept some of the Lutherans in the city because what are they going to do? Matthes urged the murder of anyone who resisted to avoid the contamination of the faithful in the city. In reaction to this, the Roman Catholic Prince Bishop, who was basically in charge of the city, he puts it under a siege. So it's surrounded by an army for the remainder of this story. But Munster was really well defended, had big, thick, sturdy walls, and it was easy to defend. Inside the city, strict communism is enforced, private property and profit are banned, debts are erased, book burnings are happening. One of the citizens was on guard duty. He complained about all this happening in his job. So Matthes finds out about it, has him dragged before the entire city, and he says, this man needs to be condemned to death immediately in front of everybody. And they're just like, wait, we have a process for this. You got to go in the courts. And a couple of men protest, and Matthes is enraged at being challenged, having his authority challenged. He immediately has those men arrested and just taken away. And then Leyden, kind of his right-hand man, there's John Matthes kind of leading this whole thing. And John of Leyden, his right-hand man, he steps forward and he takes a spear and he just stabs the guy in between the shoulder blades. But it was like a big blacksmith type guy and he doesn't die. So Leyden grabs a gun and he shoots him in the head. And he still doesn't die. For 8 more days. It's crazy. Soon after this, Matthes, this is in the public conscious now, everybody knows what happened. So Matthes collects everybody that he thinks is on the fence in regards to their loyalty and devotion to his version of Anabaptism, and he takes them all to the church and he locks them in there. And he has them waiting. They have no idea what's going to happen until he returns with armed guards. And they're throwing themselves at his feet in repentance, begging for forgiveness. And he kind of talks to God. Well, what do you think, God? Should I forgive him? And then, I've talked him into it. I've talked him into you being forgiven. So he creates this absolute devotion out of fear. He acts like he's gotten him pardoned by interacting with God himself. All this happened while the city is blockaded by an ever-growing Roman Catholic army. But Matthes has been telling everybody that there are thousands of Anabaptists on their way and the forces against them, that army outside the walls is going to be swept away. But that was not going to happen, and he knew it. So at a wedding celebration, there's a wedding celebration on Easter Day, he goes into some kind of fanatical state of supposed divine revelation. He's openly speaking to God. It's like he's fainting and His head's on the table and is putting his arms in the air, and he goes into this state and he starts kissing people on the mouth, and then he leaves. This man was truly insane. And then on the following Sunday or soon after, he barrels out of the city in full armor with about 12 men, 12 cavalrymen, to fight the entire army outside the walls. And he succeeds. He kills them all. No, I'm kidding. They immediately massacred him and these 12 men as the people watch from the city walls. They watch it happen. Their prophet goes out and literally gets chopped into pieces. His arms and legs chopped off. His head is put on a stake. And his manhood, shall we say, is nailed to the city gates of Munster. The people are shocked. Their prophet is dead. But immediately, John of Leyden, his right-hand man, he fills this power vacuum. And he declares himself the king of Munster. He says, God punished Matthias for his arrogance. He told him to do it, but it was because he was arrogant. And John of Leyden says, I foresaw all this exactly as it happened. Just 8 days ago, I saw all of it. So now, he's the prophet receiving the direct revelation from God. A week later, he shows up in the town square, stark naked, and starts running around screaming and claiming a message from God. He says, the city council we got, it's got to go. Here's 12 hand-picked men. These are the new elders. He gives them swords. The death penalty is instituted for basically everything. And everybody in the city is now required to leave the front door to their house open. Not allowed to shut it and lock it. It's complete totalitarianism at this point. Eventually, the surrounding army is scheduled to storm the city. But the day before this is going to happen, the soldiers get so drunk that they accidentally, haphazardly, attack the city the night before in their stupor, thinking it's dawn when it's actually dusk of the night before, and they're completely drunk, and the Anabaptists easily turn them away, which then emboldens them even further that God is on their side. See, we turn back this great army. This drunken, buffoonish army. So the siege went on, and conditions slowly worsened within the city. A 15-year-old girl comes up with a plan. She's going to surrender to the army outside. She's going to pretend to be a defector, and then she's going to offer the prince bishop a shirt that's been soaked in poison. So the leaders say, sure, go for it. Yeah, do that. I know that sounds made up. The plan fails. She's tortured. She's decapitated. During the nights, what was happening is the Anabaptists would kind of conduct raids, and they'd go out and they'd kill companies of drunk soldiers, go out and just slit their throats. Then things get even weirder. There's another supposed revelation received from John Leyden in the summer of 1534. Now, he says, God commands them to start practicing polygamy. Not a choice, it's a command. It seems totally out of the blue. You kind of wonder, is this just like other cult leaders that the power goes to their head and they want to take advantage of their power to satisfy their sexual lusts? Well, it may have been motivated because he had been caught sleeping with, cheating on his wife, sleeping with a maid in Nipperdalling's house. Supposedly, a defector from the army saw him doing this and he wouldn't shut up about it, so polygamy may have been his new revelation to justify his sin. Like, oh, I knew about this polygamy thing, so now I'm telling you about it too. So he wasn't actually sinning, he was just obeying God. Any opposition to this was swept away by the unquestioned authority of the prophet. After all, he's the one talking to God every day. Leyden even takes Matthias' young widow, that girl that dressed in all white, 20 years younger than he, takes her as one of his several wives. Other women were forced into marriages, even if their husbands they were outside the city. Well, they're not in here, so you're getting remarried. Or if their husbands simply weren't Anabaptist. Doesn't matter. You're getting remarried. There were reports of young teen girls being taken from their families and forced into marriages. Remember, those doors, they had to be left open. They could come in. They could do whatever they wanted. It was sexual chaos, as you would expect. Resistors were daily decapitated in the streets. Soon there was an internal revolt. They couldn't take it anymore, which almost succeeded. But they didn't act swiftly enough and decisively enough, so they're repelled and they're executed. Just murders all the time. Knipperdolling would help in the executing. He would go and he would cut people in half with his sword. So things are just crazy. It's crazy. There's more assaults coming from the outside army, but they're viciously turned back from the city walls. As they try and climb over, there's people lining the walls. They're chopping off their hands. They dump boiling lime over the walls, and it melts off the skin of the soldiers. They throw over rocks and heavy branches and objects, trees, and dropped on them to crush the soldiers. So the tactic turns from trying to get over the city walls to just starve them out. We're just going to starve out the people of Munster. Meanwhile, within the city, there's this lame goldsmith who proclaims in this somewhat of a staged event that John of Leyden was greater than a prophet. He's not just a prophet. He's actually the new King David. And then Leyden, oh so humbly, accepts his new mantle that he says this includes bearing the sword against all opposition, which he was basically already doing. He says his kingdom is never going to fail. They're going to take over the whole world. They're going to kill all the godless. And he appoints this royal court. And him and his royal court, they go around with special clothes. They have special coins and flags and emblems on all their clothes. He basically lives like a king in the midst of this communist paradise. In the fall of 1534, he personally calls a man out of the crowd and he cuts off his head right there in front of everyone just to make an example of him. So King John and his court are eating fine, but it's communism. So the people are starting to starve. They're eating shoelaces and tree bark and grass and slugs. And then they're starting to dig up graveyards and eating dead bodies out of the graveyards. And then they start killing their children to eat them. People are dying left and right on a regular basis. There's mass graves being filled. Leyden calls it a test from God. He says, God will turn the cobblestone streets into bread before he lets you starve to death. So, with unfailing faith, these followers of his follow their king, their prophet. They start biting into the stones, only to quickly learn that transubstantiation is not only fake news in the mass, it's fake news in the streets, literally. So finally, they start to doubt. And the city is filled with widespread, audible weeping and groaning. And Leyden starts to feel this pressure. And he feels it mounting, and he says, okay, the army outside these walls is going to be defeated by March 26th of 1535. He buys himself some time. He gives it a definitive date, which is never a good move to make if you're a false prophet. And he takes men, he sends them out of the city as apostles in a vain attempt to raise an Anabaptist army to come and help them. But the prince bishop has spies within the city, and all these apostles are mostly caught and killed. A few of them get through the lines. They end up starting minor insurrections in various locations. I'm going to take a brief rabbit trail here because I think this is important to illustrate something. One of these men gets through the line. He's sent out from Munster. He makes it to Bolsward up in the Netherlands. It's about a little bit northwest of Munster. There he gets a group of radical Anabaptists together, some from the Mennonite church, and they go and they take over a Roman Catholic monastery called the Old Cloister. And then from this monastery that they take over, they use it as a staging area to help the Munster Rebellion and plan to conquer the entire province surrounding it. The Old Cloister Monastery then had to be surrounded and retaken by governmental troops. Now remember yesterday when I said some of the secondary historical sources are overly generous to the Anabaptists? Well, this little event is a good example of that reality. If you read the Mennonite Historical Atlas, it describes it as a persecution event where 300 Anabaptists took refuge in the monastery before being slaughtered. It makes no mention of the direct Munster tie and their violent attempt to take over the province and supporting the barbaric, horrific stuff that's going on in Munster. It's a complete mischaracterization of what happened. The Anabaptists had overrun this monastery. It makes it sound like the troops just went in and butchered them because they're Anabaptist, just because they deny infant baptism. That's not at all what happened. These troops went to take back property that these people didn't own, and they were violently resisted. These Anabaptists were not pacifists, and they did not die as martyrs. The Netherlands was a historical refuge for Anabaptists. They weren't out hunting them down for being Anabaptists. A good portion of people in that little rebellion weren't killed in the retaking of that monastery. They were just put on trial or released even. In fact, that ringleader, that apostle guy that made it there and started the whole thing, got away alive. Interestingly, some folks from Minnow Simmons Church, including his brother Peter, were involved and or killed in that event. And he didn't react by calling it this grave injustice of slaughter. It actually triggered him to start openly condemning the Munster Rebellion for the first time publicly. And it pushed him more towards a pacifist direction. So watch out for those sources that misconstrue the Anabaptists. They're not always wrong, but it does call into question a number of supposed persecution events when you read that one being treated that way. So be careful with those Anabaptist sources. How many of those civil governments were just doing their job and resisting violent revolts by fanatical zealots convinced that they're ushering in the millennium? Too many Anabaptist sources are not very honest with the pervasive violence genuinely accredited to portions of the early Anabaptists. These firebrand insurrectionists rightly belonged in the Anabaptist category and should not be ignored because they're embarrassing. The Old Klooster is just one example, and so is Munster, which we need to return to, finish that story. So they sent out these apostles, these apostolic emissaries. Remember, they're apostolic primitivists. We talked about that yesterday. And that effort by John of Leyden largely fails. They're not going to get help from the outside. The Prince Bishop's army, what they would do is they put messages on arrows and shoot them over the city walls, trying to foment internal insurrection against the Anabaptist leaders. They promised mercy if they would just overthrow their leaders and turn the city back over to the Prince Bishop. Well, the supposed due date for this military victory given by Leyden is approaching, and things don't look good. So Leyden claims a new revelation that everybody in the city, they're not going to be physically delivered from the army. They're just going to be spiritually delivered. It's the oldest trick in the book for charlatan religious leaders. Change your prophecy to promise something that can't be seen or evaluated. Some of the starving people within the city beg to be let go so that they can go to the Prince Bishop's army and be mercifully executed. And Leyden actually says, okay, yeah, go. But you can't come back in. So these families wander out of the city. They walk this empty plot of land between the city walls and the walls that had been erected by the surrounding army. And as they approach, all the men are shot dead. And then the women and children were not received. They were left out there. They weren't allowed to come back in either direction. So they're left out there to wander in this empty land to eat grass and die of starvation and roll around on the ground. It was such a sight that some of the soldiers had their wives start smuggling food to them just because it was so horrible. The army would shoot the men because the Munsterites had multiple occasions of sending fake defectors to the Prince Bishop's troops with false information to lure them into these deadly traps, and they'd done this over and over. So he had to like capture these guys and then interview them separately and compare the information he was getting. And eventually, he gets enough solid information from true defectors, and this allows him to sneak in a band of 400 men inside the city in the middle of the night using weak points and passwords to breach the defenses. And then a battle ensues in the middle of the night. There's people throwing things from the windows, the second-story windows, onto the troops, and eventually it just reaches a stalemate, but all the focus is there in the center of the city. And at dawn, the outside troops are finally able to storm the walls, which are finally undefended. And once they're over those walls, the slaughter began, as you would expect. But they had instructions to take the Anabaptist leaders alive. Bernard Rothman was never found, ever, but likely died in the fighting, was just so mutilated they didn't know who he was. Bernard Nipperdalling was found hiding in an attic several days later. A lady turned him over to get her house back. John of Leyden was also captured. That wife, that young widow that he had taken, was decapitated. The defenses of the city, after it was retaken, were torn down so that such an event could never happen again. And then those captured leaders spent 7 months being tortured and questioned. The Prince Bishop comes in, he wants to visit Leyden in prison, and he makes a comment to him along the lines of, "Do you know how much money you have cost me in this siege, in this event?" And Leyden suggests a plan to recoup all that money. He says, "Put me in a cage, and we'll tour Europe, and you can charge people to come and see me." And then he comes up with another plan. He likewise says he should be allowed to live so that he can go to all these Anabaptist cities with any Munster-like revolutionary ideas, and he can dissuade them from making the same mistakes he did. He'll go talk him out of being this way. To both suggestions, the Prince Bishop replies, no, not happening. Finally, in January of 1536, a platform shows up in the city square with a large stake in the middle and various items of torture surrounding it, with 3 large cages off to the side. And the 3 most prominent ringleaders are brought out: John of Leyden, Bernard Nipperdalling, and Bernard Crutchling, who had served on the court of the self-proclaimed King John. We haven't talked about him, but he served on the court. And when they see what awaits them, when they're walking in and they see what awaits them, Nipperdalling is struck dumb with fear. Leyden falls on his knees and starts begging for forgiveness. And what they did is they take these 3 men and they attach them back to back to back on that pole with their arms tied up above their heads by an iron collar around their necks with spikes on the inside. And each of them can see and hear and smell what's happening to the guy next to him. They see it out of their peripheral vision. So they know, they watch what happens to one guy and they know what's coming for them. And they have to sit there and endure it. And I have to give you a content advisory warning for what happens next to these men. So it's a little rough. Leyden is first. Take his arms above his head, get an executioner on each side, 2 men on each side, and they take the red-hot tongs out of the fire. They touch the skin under his armpits, and it immediately bursts into flames. And then they tear the flesh. For a period of 1 hour, they just grab and yank over and over. Whenever Leyden passes out from pain, he's revived. And whatever time that he spent unconscious does not count towards the 1 hour of torture that he has to endure. They subtract it. Eventually, they start tearing tendons and muscles, and then they grab his tongue, they tear out his tongue and his throat. And to finally end the suffering, they take a red-hot dagger and just plunge it into his heart after an hour. While the other 2 men are just sitting there, hearing it, smelling it, watching it, knowing that they're next. Nipperdalling then comes up with this idea. He tries to kill himself using that spiked collar. He takes all the weight off of his legs trying to choke himself out using that collar. And the executioners, they notice this, so they put him back up and they put a rope in his mouth and tie it back to the pole so he can't do that with the collar. Once they're all dead, the authorities take the bodies, they put them in those cages. And they take those cages and they put them up in the only church tower that was left standing, that wasn't torn down by the men, as a warning to all. The bodies were left to rot in those cages for 50 years before the bones were finally removed. But the cages were returned to the church tower. And they're still there to this day. You can go on Google Maps and look up St. Lambert's Cathedral, and you can see the same cages hanging in the church tower. They were taken down once in the 1800s for repair, and then during a bombing in World War II, one of them was knocked down and the church steeple was damaged. So they repaired the steeple. They put those cages right back up. And just recently, in the last few years, there was a question of whether or not to retain these cages, and they put it to a vote for the people of the city of Munster, and they said, keep them up. Keep them up. Now, I know that ending is barbaric, but nobody should weep for these guys. They are not martyrs. They were psychotic, heretical killers. It's not every day that you can hear about a man having his skin torn to shreds with red-hot tongs for an hour, and yet have to hesitate to actually consider whether it was a fitting punishment. Regardless of the religion of the armies surrounding Munster, as governing authorities, they were required as ministers of God to bear the sword of justice against these men. And recognize, Munster was being used as an Anabaptist beacon to all of Central Europe, attempting to call other Anabaptists, come join us in this revolt. Go do copycat movements yourself. Christ is coming back after all. He's going to come, you're going to win these battles. They do this through constant publication of their literature and sending out emissaries from the city. It was almost a missionary movement for violent, fanatical Anabaptism. So we see that when the Anabaptists had a taste of power, they too failed to wield it justly. They too enforced religion under the threat of death. Pacifism won out in the end as the enduring Anabaptist principle, but it was initially not a unifying doctrine among them as it is today. The Anabaptists became majority pacifist because the ones that weren't were so violent that they got themselves justly killed by governmental forces. This is what gave the Anabaptists their reputation. This is why they were considered a devilish sect of satanic origin to be mercilessly eradicated. That story of Munster was well known. People knew about it. So when they hear about Anabaptist presence in their city, it kind of freaks them out. It's understandably going to cause great distress. Nobody wants that to happen again. Events like Munster and the Old Klooster cemented the reputation that was initially created by those Anabaptists who joined the Peasants' War, but it cemented that that's what they were in the public consciousness. And Anabaptism then was left in this disastrous state, even though by most accounts these violent Anabaptists were the minority, possibly because they kept getting themselves killed. They became the minority perpetually by so many of them being killed. I don't know. We don't have clear numbers on these kind of things. The Swiss Brethren and their progeny were peaceful, but they were very distrusted. And they could not outrun the violent insurrectionist reputation that all the Anabaptists now had. They needed a figure to sort of give them identity outside of radicalism and fanaticism and millennialism. And the man to do that was Menno Simons, the single most influential Anabaptist in history. The most radical sects of Anabaptists were killed off or they faded from the scene, and the peaceful, holiness-focused Swiss Brethrens were the ones that were left standing. Under Menno's leadership, they came to be known as Mennonites, the most enduring offshoot whose practices have generally over time come to be the visible face of Anabaptism today. This is what people think of nowadays when it comes to Anabaptism. You know their history as the junk drawer of the Reformation. You know that sad and ugly history. But it is fair to say that the peaceful Swiss Brethren and their ilk, those like them, developed into the Mennonites, and they are the epitome of modern-day Anabaptists. Menno Simons was a former Dutch Roman Catholic priest, as so many of them were, who didn't fully become Anabaptist until 1536. So right after this Munster incident, he comes into an Anabaptist identity. He has a humanist background, and he was able to give Anabaptism a more credible voice, which eventually, after generations, gave Anabaptists their more modern, harmless persona that everybody thinks of them as. Minnow stressed things like the community of believers, pacifism, he revived that from the Schleitenheim Confession, withdrawal from the world, very separatist. He was biblicist in the sense that he refused to use any non-biblical terms in theology. As I mentioned earlier, he did adopt that celestial flesh Christology, but that teaching gladly did not endure as an Anabaptist distinctive. From what I've seen, it's not something that persists. Their distinctives are largely characterized by practice, not doctrine. It's the things that they do, not on what they believe so much. The Anabaptist doctrine emphasis is always on what you do and not on what you believe. They generally rejected justification by faith alone and the forensic nature of justification. Like medieval Roman Catholic soteriology, which they never fully abandoned, they thought the only ground for justification was a Christian's own personal righteousness. Our sin was taken care of by Christ's death. He takes care of the sin part, but the positive righteousness part, that's our job in their minds. They still do this to this day. They never teach with clarity the imputed righteousness of Christ. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's still in it. I said, this is the biggest thing. You've got to get the imputed righteousness of Christ into your pulpits. They do not understand the law's demand for perfection. They don't get it. I get contacted, and I still meet with Anabaptists who will argue this point with me explicitly. They believe all of this in order to avoid antinomianism. They care about holiness. They want a pure church. It's a holiness movement. But it just leads to another works-based salvation system. Again, mimicking Roman Catholicism's error. In that very early Schleitenheim Confession, written by Michael Sattler, that I mentioned yesterday, they missed a golden opportunity to define themselves within the bounds of historical orthodoxy. That's what you want to do when you write a confession. Instead, they define themselves negatively by what they're not. This is how we're different. We're not like you guys. They didn't deny essential doctrines in their confession, they just simply ignored it. So there's nothing in there about the Trinity, nothing about all these core essential doctrines. They just ignore it. But that which is not confessed, generation after generation, degrades generation after generation until it's totally lost. They are a perfect example of that. The Schleitenheim Confession is very short. You can read it in a few minutes. Pull it up and read it. In it, this is what they confessed. Number one, credo baptism. They called it infant baptism the highest and chief abomination of the Pope. Number two, they said the practice of the band, but by which, when they say that, all that they really mean is excommunication. You have to practice church discipline. For somebody who's been warned about a sin twice, then they get banned or excommunicated. That later develops into excommunication with the addition of shunning, which is where you don't even eat with them. Number three, the practice of communion, but only for true baptized believers. Okay, no big deal. Number four, the separation of the saved from the world, but when they talk about it, it's a fairly extreme sense of that idea. That later develops into their inward-focused communities that they're known for, that have little contact with the outside world. Pastors in the church, number five, they say pastors in the church need to be godly and chosen by the local congregation. Again, not a huge deal. Number six is where they confess their pacifism, meaning that the church cannot bear the sword. We agree. Only the civil magistrate can bear the sword. That's right. The church's tool is discipline, or as they've made it, punishment. But because of that, they said Christians should not even serve in the magistrate at all, because they bear the sword. So don't even serve in the magistrate, which is taking it a little too far. And then number seven, they had this thing about forbidding the swearing or taking of oaths. That one endured too. The emphasis of these articles is holiness in the church. You can tell as you read them, that's what they really care about. And even though the Schleitenheim is generally not even used, or cited or held in Anabaptist churches. You can't walk in and get one, and they don't have them posted on their website. All 7 of those positions that I just read were present, at least in the church where I was growing up. All 7 of those were there. If these 7 articles were the Anabaptist only addition to evangelical Protestantism, then they would merely be a slightly quirky sect. Still worthy of respect and fraternity, a little weird, but still part of us. But in only confessing these 7 articles, they left open the definition of the gospel itself. They didn't confess it. And then if the Anabaptists have shown anything through their 500-year tradition, it is that they rarely, if ever, produce any documents or churches with the true gospel clearly articulated. There's one more confession that's even lesser known than the Schleitenheim. It comes from the Dutch Mennonites in 1632. It's called the Dordrecht Confession of Faith. That's the same Dort as the Canons of Dort. It's longer, a little bit fuller, slightly more doctrinal, but still severely lacking when it comes to a historical confession. It confesses the practices such as shunning. They had instituted foot washing, marriages within their own church only, forbidding of oaths, and forbidding of revenge. And interestingly, ordained deaconesses. But it surprisingly also confesses, though not too fully, it confesses doctrines like the Trinity and the resurrection of the dead and hell. Doesn't really explain them, but it mentions them so you can tell that they believe it. And it also used words from the Nicene Creed. Again, it's pretty rare for them to use historical creeds like that. If you read it carefully, though, you can see their Arminianism. It basically denies total depravity and says that faith precedes regeneration. It emphasizes holiness, though. Emphasizes holiness. They clearly de-emphasize theology. They want to be like, all right, don't really worry about what you believe. Just worry about how correct your behavior is. Don't worry about the correct system of doctrine. That's another enduring Anabaptist characteristic. A pure church through holiness while neglecting theology. They're always like that. This is why their church discipline devolved into church punishment. They have to get the impure people out. That person's not pure anymore because he doesn't have a righteousness imputed to them. He messed up creating his own righteousness. Get him out. They're impure. Everybody's working for their own righteousness. That if they all have the same idea of imputed righteousness, then they can see we're all equally righteous and justified in Christ because it's not based on us. But they don't get that. So they're working to purify their own churches through shunning and excommunication. That's why they do that. This is why they're always working so hard for salvation. They're creating their own holiness through obedience. They do not believe Christ's righteousness is imputed to them through faith. Their odd practices are directly tied to their theological error. Theology has to undergird our orthopraxy. The things that we do have to be based on what we believe. The same theological error that undergirded their odd practices are the same. It's the same theological error that created the odd practices in the Roman Catholic Church. It's fundamentally the same. They are just radically decentralized. When the Anabaptists do it, they're radically decentralized from an established historical church, which made their theology radically disorganized and ill-defined. They do not produce systematic theologies or meaningful exegetical works. They generally demur from theological definition. They are notoriously difficult to pin down when asking to have doctrine explained. But it can be detected by looking at the communities that they have always produced. That's where you'll get a glimpse of that theology. In those communities, they have what is called a lived-in dogma. It's more of a lived-in dogma than a confessional dogma. You know the ins and outs by being a part of that insular community that they create. And through living that experience, you learn the practical dogma. You're not reading a book and learning it, you're living it, and you see it around you, and you just pick it up. Like almost learning a second language. Saturation with others around you. That's how you learn it. That's how they do their dogma. Lived in dogma. Even in my background, we had this phrase, FTW, from the world to jokingly referred to church members who were not raised Anabaptists like the rest of us. And we could see they didn't know that lived-in dogma as well as we did. We could detect it. The practical dogma that you learn through experience is centered on outward holiness. You learn how to look and how to talk and how to behave and what to do. You learn it through experience of around you. It's centered on outward holiness, which is detected and evaluated by submission to those traditions that we talked about. It's quite simply moralism, not grace. It's moralism. They say their works are of grace, but they mean it the same way the Roman Catholics do, that grace empowers them to be personally holy enough to be saved. This lived-in dogma and moralism have created cult-like tendencies of radical separationism and authoritarianism. Their radical separatism is so distinct that inbreeding is a legitimate problem in many of their communities. It wasn't so bad in the one that I grew up in, but I still know multiple married couples that are second or third cousins. And there was just no scandal about it. It was just understood that we were far more closely related than most of what our society was comfortable with. So Anabaptism has become a sort of mystical biblical pietism. That's sort of what it is now. Mystical biblicist pietism. It is woodenly literal, but very selective of when it's going to be woodenly literal. There's a radical dichotomy between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I've seen some of them openly question if the biblical patriarchs were even saved, because they were in the Old Testament. Jesus wasn't even there yet. Are they saved? I don't know. Shocking to hear. They will casually entertain severe error and almost inadvertently wander into heresy because they have this cavalier attitude towards historical theology. Even many that come out of the Anabaptist churches that decide to leave are left extremely vulnerable. I've likened them to babies that are crawling on the floor, and anything they find they pick up and they put in their mouth because they can't tell the difference between food. They have no discernment between food or a rock or a dead bug. They don't know. Whatever's in front of them, what's this? I'll try it. That's kind of the way they are when they come out with doctrine and other churches and movements. They wear their non-systematic mentality like a badge of honor. When they're faced with inconsistencies, they take their faith's endurance through those inconsistencies, in spite of those inconsistencies, as proof of the strength of their faith. They cannot explain how we are saved apart from the law. If you say, well, we're saved by faith apart from the law, what does that mean? Well, good luck getting them to try and define that. For them, all they'll conclude is, well, I know I'm supposed to have faith. I know I'm supposed to have good works. How they work together, I don't know. Nor am I convinced that it matters. And that's the important thing. They don't know about such things. They don't think about such things. They're not thinking that the theology and doctrine matter. They think obey, work, be good, submit. That's their inner monologue as they walk their spiritual walk. Machen once said of liberalism, he said, it is altogether in the imperative mood, while Christianity begins with a triumphant indicative. Meaning liberalism is all about do this, do this, do this, do that, do that, do that, whereas Christianity starts with Christ did this for you. And I think that same accusation can be made of Anabaptists. They live in the imperative mood. Think, or obey, do, work, submit. And those imperatives revolve around their authoritarian, idiosyncratic traditionalism. They have never understood how serious it is to add to the law of God with man's laws. They've never understood that. And it has been their downfall. Because of all of this, I think it's fair to say that the Anabaptists have missed the boat on the Reformation. Their forced asceticism is not admirable. Their old-fashioned dress and lifestyle is not quaint. Their communities are sheltering a web of traditionalism from which they are terrified to escape. Their unique communities and churches and lifestyle have actually become an idol to them. I'm not saying that they're all unsaved. They're surely not. But without a doubt, the more Anabaptist that they are, the more likely they don't know the gospel. If you ever get a chance to interact with them, evangelize them. Help them get into a healthy church. Don't be surprised if they are skittish around you or openly skeptical towards outsiders. Avoid any form of aggression with them. Do not be offended if they rebuff you. For them to leave their communities and their churches is a life-changing event. It often disconnects them from everything and everyone that they've ever known, and they're going to be just shunned and ignored by friends and sometimes family. We experienced a fraction of it because we're closer and closer to a modern age, but we had to defend ourselves as we came out. So if you interact, be patient, be kind, trust in the Holy Spirit to break through that hardened Swiss-German psychology. Because once it is truly regenerate, it becomes a powerful weapon for God's kingdom. And you will find ex-Anabaptists make great church members, and I hope to see many more of them in the future, if the Lord wills. We should finish with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we know the Anabaptists are a minority group, and we do not interact with them much. But I pray that these lectures would be helpful in preparing us for whenever we do. I pray that you would continue to pull people out of any kind of idolatry or traditionalism that does not adequately teach the work of Christ in both his atoning sacrifice and the imputed righteousness that merits eternal life for us. Help them to get that so they can rest in Christ and so they can feel that freedom, and that they're not working to be saved, but they're working out of gratitude, and then they can have the joy of eternal life and eternal worship of Christ for this great work of which we are so, so thankful. We pray these all in his name. Amen.
This is part 3 of the lectures titled The Anabaptist, the Junk Drawer of the Reformation. The first 2 were given at a conference down in Birmingham at Dominion Baptist Church. This one is more of a podcast style, a little less formal, a little bit more free-flowing, but I wanted to record it to kind of fill in some of the gaps of stuff I had to skip over too quickly, or things that I wanted to say but just didn't have time to say. And I figured this would kind of be the best way to do that without, obviously I'm not going to get another chance to give 3 straight lectures on the Anabaptist, but I think this is worth doing because there is interest. There's a lot of questions. People seem to be interested, and there's so much confusion around this group that I think they are worthy of giving a little bit more detail too. So let me get into it a little bit. I wanted to address the question of the argument of what they were then versus what they are now. And I used that title, The Junk Drawer of the Reformation, to show how they were this group where everybody just threw in, lumped everybody in there that was anti-establishment, everybody that was anti-Paedo-Baptist, essentially, and that is not necessarily what they are now. They're not so broad now. What they have now become are pietistic modern-day monks of sorts. And I want to bring that out a little bit more because that trajectory of becoming modern-day pietistic monks was set very early on in the 1520s and 30s by it becoming a holiness movement amongst the portion of the Anabaptists that survived. So a bunch of the Anabaptists didn't survive. They got killed off or died off naturally. Not necessarily like physically died off, but their theology and practice pretty much died off. The millenarians, the radical anti-establishment types, the violent types, the doomsdayers, that type sort of got either killed off or just did not survive because they were doomed to not survive theologically. Those types are just pretty nutty and don't really last. So that broad definition I gave of the junk drawer of the Reformation, and I gave that very long definition saying they were these all the miscellaneous sects, radicals, revolutionaries, mystics, spiritualists, apocalyptic preachers, and lunatics that cropped up in Europe during the confusion that naturally emerged from the rigid and stratified religious, socio-economic world that had been turned upside down by the combined forces of the Reformation and the Renaissance. That very long definition, that is what they were then. That's what they were considered. It wasn't necessarily always fair. Some of them I don't think were even technically Anabaptist in the sense that they were against Roman Catholic baptism, but not necessarily infant baptism. They were Catabaptists. That's a different category than Anabaptist, but we just don't have enough detail. I think that there was a very rare breed. There weren't a ton of Catabaptists, but I think some of them were just anti-clerical, anti-Roman Catholic, anti-establishment, and they got lumped in with these Anabaptists, but Anabaptists themselves, the formal ones, were the ones that were technically against infant baptism. So what happened was they became a holiness movement, and I want to fill in a little bit of the details on how that came to be by their lack of articulating justification clearly, and also from Michael Sattler. He seemed to be a big part of it. Michael Sattler's influence, who, again, I talked about him in the very first lecture, his martyrdom, the mystery around maybe his beliefs, the specifics of his doctrine aren't super clear. He seemed to abandon the Roman Catholic monastic ideas quickly after he studied the Pauline epistles. We know that. He left his monastery. He was married very soon after that, and he went to Zurich along with other Anabaptists to join the Swiss Brethren. He was expelled from there fairly quickly after he arrived because they were starting to clamp down on the Anabaptists, and he went to Strasbourg, which is a Reformed city, a Protestant city, and he was received into the home of the reformer Wolfgang Capito, or Capito. I'm not even sure how his name is pronounced. He's not a very well-known guy. But Martin Bucer was also there. So he goes there, and he's received into the home of these guys. And we do know that once he left there, he was commended by both of those men. Both of those men wrote from Strasbourg commending Michael Sattler. So that was a positive for him. Sattler did seem to most closely align with the Zurich Swiss Brethren, which again is good because those Zurich Swiss Brethren were in the process of reforming. They were with Zwingli. They were reforming right along. We can assume, more than anybody, we can assume that they had a orthodox view of justification. Justification by faith alone was part of the reform in Zurich. So the fact that he aligned with them it gives us hope that Sattler was on board with that he aligned with justification by faith alone, because that was a distinctive of them. But then we read things such as, like, from the Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia, says that both Sattler and Hans Dank, questioned the Lutheran doctrine of justification and also held that works were important to man's salvation, which again just raises a ton of questions. What does that mean? Works are important to man's salvation. In what sense? Who's denying that works are important to man's salvation? Nobody. But what role do they play? Are they important in getting men saved, or are they important in showing that men are saved? That's a huge distinction. And the fact that they question the Lutheran doctrine of justification, if that's accurate, if the Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia is right in that, that's not a good sign, because the Lutherans got the doctrine of justification by faith alone right at the Reformation. So the fact that they're questioning it, that raises more questions than it answers. Why did they say that? Why were they questioning the doctrine of the Lutheran, or the Lutheran understanding of justification? Did they really do that. And was it on the particulars of the doctrines? And what specifically? We're not super sure, but that means that's important. And I don't know that you're ever going to get the clarity on Sattler's supposed disagreement. We do know that Dank and Sattler had disagreement with each other. They weren't necessarily in agreement on it with everything. And we know that Sattler had disagreements with his discussions with Martin Butzer and Capito, the two reformers in Strasbourg that he was with. They had these discussions. They received him into the home. They had brotherly discussions. So it's possible, even based on what they talked about, it's possible he might have held to a version of limited atonement and even election and predestination, which would be surprising and an anomaly amongst the Anabaptists. But Sattler might have held to that along with the Swiss Brethren, because the Swiss Brethren probably did. Sattler may have bought into that as well in his alignment. We know that he disagreed some with Dank, and what did he disagree with Dank, though? We just don't know. It does appear that they discuss justification by faith alone in some degree, but the details on that aren't clear. What they discussed, what they agreed with. Now, does Sattler just say, does he just want a greater emphasis on works? What are the details there? We don't know, and I don't know that it's ever going to be found out. So they had these discussions. Butzer and Capito both said the discussions were brotherly discipline and peace. So they didn't necessarily agree, but we don't know what they disagreed on, but it was a brotherly discussion, a respectful discussion. So that's a little bit frustrating, but that's history with the Anabaptists. You're not going to get absolute clarity on this sort of thing, and we have all these questions. So here is what Capito said of Sattler when he commended him after Sattler left and Capito wrote. He says this, and there's a little bit of a long quote, but I think this is very, very helpful. So he said this: "This Michael is known to us here in Strasbourg, and he was somewhat in error, which we showed him through the scriptures. But since he saw a lack in our preachers and other preachers of the true doctrine, especially in the outward life of the congregation, he perhaps paid less attention to our admonition. But at the same time, he showed such great zeal for the honor of God and the church of Christ, which he would have pure and blameless and without reproach to those who are outside. We never censored this, but praised it highly. But his method and the articles of his faith we always kindly rejected, and that was after mature reflection before God. Now, we did not agree with him herein. He wanted to make pious Christians through a fixed creed and outward compulsion, which we considered the beginning of a new monkery." That is very important. He goes on. "But we desired to correct the life of the believers through consideration of God's good deeds, which he has shown us in body and soul, that it might be full of fruit of love and gratitude. For this is the way and the order of salvation." That is massively insightful. He saw in Sattler this pushing of a holiness movement. And he saw in Sattler the reason why he wasn't trusting what they were saying is because he's seeing these, well, not all your people, not all your clergy, not all your people are coming around and leading these holy lives that Christians are to lead. And therefore he doesn't take what they say with as much importance as he should have. Now, why is he seeing that? Because of sacralism and infant baptism that makes these people Christians by virtue of being part of the state church. But they're not actually Christians in terms of conversion. They're not born again. They're not Christians by conviction necessarily. They're just part of the state church. So let's say a priest is in the Roman Catholic Church, and then Reform sweeps through the city, and a lot of these guys go along with Reform, and this priest doesn't really care. He's not born again. He's not really a Christian. He's just there as a political office. He goes along with it, goes along to get along. He's not necessarily going to start leading a holy life all of a sudden. He'll go along with these things. So you're not going to find broad sweeping conversions necessarily when these cities change over. Not everybody that was Roman Catholic and now is considered Reformed is suddenly a true born-again believer. And Sattler sees this, and he's like, well, what you're saying in your doctrine must not be true, because look at the fruit it's producing. It's not producing these holy lives, and he would reject it. Well, that's because of sacralism and infant baptism. It's the fact that they're considered Christians when they're not really Christians. So I think what he's seeing in that lack of holiness, we can root in the error of sacralism and infant baptism. But the fact that Capito saw that he wanted to make pious Christians through a fixed creed and outward compulsion, and they considered that a new monkery, that is what Anabaptists became. That is the beginning of, this is a holiness movement. We need holiness in the church, and we don't care about the doctrine. We care about the obedience to law. So they push law. And Capito says, we want to do it through consideration of God's good deeds, which he has shown us in body and soul, that it might be a fruit of love and gratitude, for that is the way and the order of salvation. He's saying, we convert people with the gospel. Sattler wants to convert them with the law. But the Reformed recognize you don't convert with the law. The law tells you how to live. It's important. But the gospel does the converting. That is the means God uses. The Holy Spirit converts through the hearing of the gospel. This is a massive, important thing. Anabaptists go to law. Reformed went to gospel. The Anabaptists don't understand that distinction between law and gospel. And so they institute a new monkery. That is, they became the pietist new monks. That's what we see in the Anabaptists. They invented a new monkery. When you look at the Old Order Mennonites, the one with the true Anabaptist identity, the Old Order Mennonites, the Amish, the super conservative, traditionalist, I don't want to say conservative because that's not accurate, traditionalism, the Hutterites, those are the ones with the true Anabaptist identity, and they're living as new monks, pietists. So, I think Capito saw Sattler's error right, and I think Sattler's error set in motion the trajectory. He set the trajectory for the future of the Anabaptists as a holiness movement and becoming that new monkery. But then we also have this commendation from Butzer. He said, we do not doubt that Michael Sattler, who was burned at Roderburg, was a dear friend of God, although he was a leader of the Anabaptists, but much more skilled and honorable than some. So Butzer rightly sees, like, some of these Anabaptists are nuts, some of them are honorable men, and Sattler was a dear friend of God. So that gives me hope, again, right there, to be optimistic about Sattler. That he was a friend of God. He was confused on some things. He didn't understand law and gospel. He got his methodology wrong for creating Reformation. The reformers want to reform the church by getting the doctrine right, and therefore the people will then be converted and they'll start leading lives of holiness. Sattler is more, and the Anabaptists as a holiness movement are more force the law, give them law, but they get that wrong. They're blatantly wrong there, because law does not convert, and this is why I say they missed the boat on the Reformation. The distinction between law and gospel, the understanding of those roles, is a huge part of the Reformation. And the Anabaptists basically took the Roman Catholic position. Most of them didn't abandon the Roman Catholic idea of synergism and the way that grace is essentially earned through obedience. The Roman Catholics used the sacramental system to get that grace. The Anabaptists used their new monkery. What Capito called a new monkery, and he's right. He's right on that. So, hopefully, Sattler just had a methodological error here on law and gospel, and it's not that he actually disagreed on justification by faith alone. We don't know that for sure, but we hope, based on Butzer's words, calling a friend of God, that that is the case. I don't think that stayed the case for Anabaptists going into the future. I think Sattler set it in motion as a holiness movement. Minnow Simmons absolutely furthered that, but I don't think they stayed as orthodox on justification by faith alone. They are rejecting the Reformed doctrine of justification by faith alone overall as a tradition that's, I mean, obviously not every single one, but as a tradition, that's generally what happened. I think that the Anabaptists got deeper and deeper mired in error as that tradition grew. And maybe if Sattler had been able to stick around and the Swiss Brethren had been able to stick around, definitely if the Swiss Brethren had been able to stick around, they wouldn't have gone so off the rails in terms of doctrine, or at least in failing to define themselves doctrinally. And that's just an awful thing that happened. Sattler killed by Roman Catholics, several of the Swiss Brethren killed by Roman Catholics as well. Some of that fault lies at the hands of the Reformed in the sacralism. They did not reform that for many years, many decades. So that's unfortunate, and they are to blame for that. So nobody is fault-free here. Most of the fault lies with the Roman Catholics, of course. In those other talks, talking about how radical some of these Anabaptists are, and they got themselves killed, and some of them genuinely deserve to be killed as being really rotten people. I don't mean to imply that some of them weren't genuinely martyred. They were. But, and I gave some examples of some that were genuinely martyred, some that weren't, some that were allowed to live in peace. The fact that Sattler was received in kindness in Strasbourg, a Reformed city, again, reflects that toleration and that willingness to talk as long as you're not too radical of a heretic. But the fact remains, in that day and age, if you are a flat-out heretic, you're going to get yourself killed. If you deny the Trinity, if you're an atheist, if you deny some doctrines that, were wrong, you can get yourself killed. But if some of these guys getting killed that were genuine heretics, they don't deserve to be killed civilly, but that was the civil rule then. But it doesn't make them good guys. Michael Servetus was a genuine heretic when he was killed by the Genevan city council. Calvin asked that he not be burned. They rejected Calvin's pleas. Calvin evangelized him all the way to the stake, walked with him, trying to get him to recant. Could not. But the idea was still that heretics were killed back then, and he was a real heretic. But him being killed as a heretic doesn't make him right, doesn't make him not a heretic. I think it's also worthy to note that Philip of Hesse, a ruler in Germany, he was one of the guys that fought against the Peasants' War when they revolted, but he did not allow Anabaptists to be killed. So even Anabaptists say that he showed extraordinary generosity and kindness to them. You'll find them saying that about Philip of Hesse. He saw them as a disorder in religious life, which had its roots in error and weakness in the faith, rather than in moral error like sedition and revolt, and which must therefore be treated with leniency and consideration. He's exactly right with that consideration, that some of them were just a disorder religiously. They were wrong. They weak in the faith. They had error, but they weren't all trying to do this sedition and revolt like they got the name from the Munsterites and those that were trying to help the Munsterites or trying to flock to the Munsterites or trying to mimic the Munsterites. Not all of them were that way, but they had this reputation. Philip of Hesse saw through that. So that's another good example. Philip of Hesse didn't want him killed. He also mentioned, and this is important too, that they had improved conduct over some of the Lutherans. Philip of Hesse saw that. Some of these Anabaptists are leading more holy lives than these Lutherans. Why is that? Again, sacralism and infant baptism. These Lutherans weren't Lutherans by conviction. They were Lutherans because their city became Lutheran. Because Lutheranism spread in areas, and because they live in those areas, they're considered Lutherans. But they're not convictionally Lutheran. They're not born-again believers. Even if they agree with it, they're not necessarily born again just by saying, I reject the Roman Catholic Church, and I like the Lutheran one more. So Philip of Hesse saw that, and I think that's accurate. He saw the Anabaptists living more holy lives because people that were Anabaptists by conviction. They're not born into it. That's part of being Anabaptist. You're not born into being an Anabaptist. So that's very important. I think that's worthy of note. A few other things I want to mention regarding Munster. As Munster became, it's this diverse city, and as it had this change coming through it, it's sympathetic towards Lutheranism. It's technically Roman Catholic, overseen by a prince bishop, Roman Catholic prince bishop, and meanwhile it's becoming radically Anabaptist. And as this change is happening, as the Lutheranism spread and was tolerated and eventually became the dominant thing, and then the Anabaptist spread, from the outside, that was largely seen as Protestant. Whether right or wrong at that point is unclear. Very early on, like Bernard Rothman, who was one of the first guys in there preaching, he's Lutheran, he's reforming, and then he suddenly becomes Anabaptist. He may have been Orthodox very early on, and then only radicalized after the arrival of more and more Anabaptists and seeing this momentum. I don't know where we could get absolute. You would probably have to look at the pamphlets that they were producing and see if you can see a trend towards greater and greater radicalization. That would be difficult work. I don't know if anyone's ever going to take the time to do that. But in response to the movement in Munster, Catholic leaders in December of 1532, so that's 3 years, I guess about 2 years when it's all added up, 2.5 years before the end of the rebellion. But in 1532, they see this Protestant movement that's happening in Munster, soon to be an Anabaptist revolt. But they convened a strategic conference just outside the city, and that was broken up by an armed and angry mob of Munsterites. So a larger confrontation was narrowly avoided when neutral negotiations broached a compromise, recognizing the divided nature of the city, of the church in the city. So that's really interesting. Even as early as 1532, the prince bishop sees this is going on. They convene this thing, and Munsterites come out and break it up. They got radical pretty quick. So more interesting information. They were willing to take up arms very early on, and it almost got worse before they brought in those neutral negotiations to broach that compromise. So that Munster story, there's no end to the details and how interesting it is. I don't know that I mentioned this guy's name, but the one eyewitness account that we have is Herman von Kessenbrock, who was a Roman Catholic historian, or his parents were booted out of Munster when they kind of cleared the city. And he went back years later and pulled a bunch of records and told eyewitness accounts and retold the story. His account is probably to be taken with a grain of salt. He's very anti-Anabaptist. He's probably going to take the worst stories and include them for sure as true in his retelling. His book is in German because he's German, but it got published in, I think, the 18th century. It is published in English, but it is a Brill publication. If you know anything about publishing, Brill is a very scholarly publishing house and publish things that almost no one reads. So their books are outrageously expensive. I think his is somewhere between $200 and $300, maybe a little over. I saw most of it were over $300. So that's not atypical for Brill publications. But you can see portions of his writing on Google Books. There's some woodcuts that are really interesting from the torture and from some of the Anabaptist guys, Knipperdoling and Rothman, Mathis, Leiden. I think there's some woodcuts in there that you can see. So that's interesting. I would love to get my hands on that Brill publication. I don't know that I'm ever gonna. I seriously doubt it. If you were looking for more information, you might want to look at an article called For the Honor of God and to Fulfill His Will, the Role of Polygamy in Anabaptist Munster. That's by Darren Williamson. If you have access to scholarly articles, you might be able to get that. If you know my email, traver7@yahoo.com, you could email me. I could send it to you. Also, Anthony Arthur wrote a book called The Taylor King, The Rise and Fall of the Anabaptist kingdom of Munster. And that would also be pretty interesting to you if you're looking into more details of Munster. Like I said, there's just no end to the details on how interesting it is. And I'm sure there's some that are not true, but even if half, like I said, even if half of them are true, it's the craziest story that you're ever going to read in church history. Some more things about that. The polygamy, when it was instituted, Bernard Rothman initially resisted that idea pretty strongly, along with some others, but was eventually convinced, and I say eventually, relatively quickly, but it took some convincing. And it was the prophetic authority of John of Leyden that really got him to believe it. And this got to the point where Rothman was so convinced that he was publishing pamphlets and distributing a theological defense of the practice. And those are still available. We can still read his explanations why polygamy ought to be reinstituted in Munster and why they thought it was okay. Now there are other reasons that are interesting to talk about, like the fact that they basically had a 3-to-1 women to men ratio, and some say, well, they needed to stabilize things socially and things of that nature. There's proposals of why it may have been. There's that explanation, I think, that Herman von Kessenbrock gives, that Leyden had been caught sleeping with a maid in Knipperdalling's house, and he was trying to cover his tracks. So that there's a lot more information about the polygamy thing. And I talked about it being sexual chaos, and I don't mean that as in there was rampant sexual perversion or a wild love fest like these Anabaptists are a bunch of hippies. I mean, they are in a sense and they aren't in a sense. They were actually quite strict in their sexual moral code like the other Anabaptists, with the exception of the polygamy. They still had the death penalty for adultery and fornication and stuff like that. So it's not a rampant love fest like it's just sexual chaos in the sense of just perversion, but it is perverted in the sense of the polygamy and the forcing into marriage that happened. Rothman advocated the idea that sex was purely for procreation, which they wanted to increase the population. They wanted more procreation. They had way too many females and they needed more males. They needed to grow. They wanted to, create this Anabaptist uprising in the entire world. Leyden said that he was going to take over the world. He's going to be king of the world eventually. So they're not necessarily doing it out there satisfying their basest desires. I think there's an element of that to it. I think there always is with polygamy. Anytime polygamy has been instituted, there is an element of this is so men can have sex with more women. That's just a reality to it. But some of them actually viewed the polygamy as a way to avoid more sexual sin because, look, these people can't control their desires. If we institute polygamy, then some of these needs can be met by, say, some of these women or whatever it may be, and we'll stop more fornication and adultery. Now, that's probably a ridiculous thing to think, but some of them say that that's what they were thinking. It was relationally chaotic, revolving around the realm of sex, but it wasn't sexually chaotic as in just people out in the streets doing anything and getting away with anything. So they still had the resistors to this decapitated, but so were those that were sinning sexually, adultery, incest, rape, fornication, other unclean sexual sin. There was still the death penalty instituted for that sort of thing. So I wanted to clarify a little bit of the sexual chaos comment on Munster. I want to return a little bit to their idea of justification, imputed righteousness, what they believed, what they didn't. Something interesting can be found in Peter Reidemann. I'm not even sure how to say his last name either. He's called the second Hutterite, or the second leader or founder of the Hutterites. He actually wrote a confession of sorts, and it's fairly lengthy, surprisingly lengthy. And you can see in his writings something that a common theme of basically an unclear explanation of justification and how it's by faith and works and what they mean by it. Because when you read him, it's shockingly similar, and he's not the only one, but it's shockingly similar to the Roman Catholic idea of infused righteousness. They want to say, oh, these works are important, but the works are not our own. They're done by grace. They're works of Christ in us. But they're still your works that are getting you justified. Well, Roman Catholics basically say the exact same thing. They say the righteousness of Christ is infused into us, and we become more righteous and do the works of Christ by grace, and only by those works are we justified. And that's really, really close to what the Anabaptists say. When they do say anything, it sounds very, very close to that. And that's different than imputed righteousness that's counted to us. And that righteousness is perfect. It's Christ's righteousness that's perfect, and that gets you justified through faith alone. Now, the righteousness that we do as we are sanctified and made more like Christ, also by faith alone, but as that happens, we do good works, but those are a reflection of the fact we've been born again. That's the Reformed idea. It's very different than the infused righteousness idea. What I found shocking was the similarity of the description of righteousness and how that leads to justification from Roman Catholicism to the Anabaptist. They don't use that formal language and the technicalities that you'll see, but the concept is nearly identical, which again goes back to that point that they didn't really abandon the medieval Roman Catholic ideas of soteriology and how you're saved. That's them becoming a holiness movement. They saw the lives of this supposedly Christian Europe, like Sattler, just like this Peter Reidemann. He says the same thing. They say disgraceful lives in the clergy, and because the clergy was treated as a class or as an occupation, a means of social mobility, and a lot of these priests and monks were rotten to the core, and they saw that. And when Lutheranism or Reform swept through a city, not all of those priests and monks were genuinely converted to the Reformation. So you can see a lack of holiness amongst them. And the Anabaptists saw it, they were sickened by it, and they were determined to become a holiness movement. And I lay that at the feet of sacralism and infant baptism. So their focus became moralism and holiness. And they sought to end that by the law instead of the gospel. And they created this new kind of monkery. They became a holiness movement. That's ultimately what they devolved into after the Swiss Brethren were out of the picture, after Sattler set that in motion. The most doctrinally grounded of the bunch got taken out of the picture all too swiftly. I really think that's the cause. The Anabaptists were seeing a society that was supposedly Christian, and they were seeing these despicable lives led by people, and they just said, nope, that must be wrong. So they wanted a moral reform. They wanted a pure church. Capito saw that in Sattler. He wanted a pure church. And who doesn't? But the reasons they weren't seeing it were not because the doctrine of the Reformation was wrong. It's because it was new on the scene, and sacralism was still in place. If that doctrine had time, then yes, the gospel would be preached throughout Europe, and people would be converted and join the church by choice, by conviction. You know, that's what we eventually got to. People aren't born into the church. Well, I mean, not so much anymore, depending on where you're at. There's still state churches, but it's different. And this is why I say they missed the boat on the Reformation. This early fundamental misunderstanding of law and gospel set the trajectory for where the Anabaptists would go and what they would become after these radical violent sects were killed off. So that's why they have become what they are today, this new form of monkery. It's kind of a sad thing, but they still have this authoritarian, idiosyncratic set of traditions that they use, this law that they try to force, the authoritarian abuse of authority in the church by the leaders, trying to force these things that you see in the Amish, the Old Order, Mennonite, and other groups. The shaming of those that leave to make them question their salvation. There's no salvation outside of this group. They're not out winning hearts with the gospel. They're not making people obey out of gratitude and thanks for what's been done for them in Christ. They're forcing it by fear of the law. And that is why they missed the boat on the Reformation. That's why they became what they are, what they have become. It's those theological errors that they failed to overcome 500 years ago. So I hope that brings a little bit more clarity. I might keep adding to this. I know it's a bit repetitive, but I want people to see the difference in the Anabaptists, what they were, what they became, the ones that died off, the ones that lived on, some of the very early ones. I genuinely think they could have been a Puritan type movement if they had been given the time to set their feet concretely in the Reformed doctrine and push away from sacralism, away from infant baptism, and get to what the particular Baptist eventually got to 100 years later. They're not the spiritual forefathers of the particular Anabaptist, but they anticipate them in a way. The Swiss Brethren, that is, not the Anabaptist as a whole, just the Swiss Brethren in Zurich. And I will keep it isolated to them because they're the ones that were the most solid doctrinally. When you read these other guys, like, where can you read them explaining justification by faith alone? Where can you read anything that's capable of refuting Roman Catholicism in terms of their soteriology, in terms of the concepts of Roman Catholic soteriology that is wrong? Not just the sacramental system, not just the weird traditions that Roman Catholicism came up with, but the actual heart of Roman Catholicism, the syncretism and the synergism of Roman Catholicism. They don't have writings that are capable of really rejecting it. It's just a demand for holiness, and then all these idiosyncratic authoritarian traditions that they come up with, the weird stuff that they come up with, like, well, you can read about it in some of the confessions. Read Peter Reidman's confession. You can Google that, and that'll come up. And, I mean, again, if you want some of these sources, you can email me. And I've got a lot of them saved in a folder as I work through this stuff. I've saved it, and if you want to read some of it, you can email me, and I can send some of it on to you. But this growth of Anabaptism in the Reformational Europe, where sacralism and infant baptism are still so dominant, this shows how important holiness and separateness from the world are in convincing people that your message of Christ is true. Because if you don't have that, you're just not going to convince nearly as many people. It's just massively important that you personally lead a holy life and are separated from the world when you're delivering the message of Christ, especially when the outside world is so dark. You have to be set apart from them. And the fact that Anabaptism rose like this, and for the reason that it did, shows why that is so important. And that is a lesson that we can take away. A demand for holiness of life and a demand for separateness from the world, so that our message of the gospel is truly considered. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to believe it, but they're not going to be distracted by, like, why am I listening to this guy when he lives this way? Or there's this church supposedly in this state that believes this way, and look at the lives that I see amongst these people. Why would I believe that message? You know, it's funny. I worked for Caterpillar, and there was a Muslim guy that I had a conversation with, and he considered America this Christian nation. And he said, this is Christianity? Look at your nation. Look at your entertainment industry. And I was with him, and I said, no. That is not because they're Christian. We are not a Christian nation in that sense. This isn't a bunch of, like, yeah, you can find polls of people calling themselves Christian, but no, they're not all Christian. And this Muslim was seeing and reacting the way that the Anabaptist looked at Europe and said, oh, this is Christianity, huh? Well, I reject that. That's what this Muslim was doing. Oh, this America, this is what Christianity is? I reject that. And it strikes me as it's the same thing going on, and that's why it's so important that we lead these holy lives that are separate from the world. People look at that and it matters. It will kill your message if we are a church of unholy people that are the same as the world, look the same as the world, act the same as the world, believe the same as the world. It kills the message of the gospel. So there's a lesson to be learned. I might keep adding to this. I might add a fourth as more things come on. As I think of more things, I just can't stop the reading. It's so interesting. If you get into the sources, it's so hard to stop reading. I wish there was more clarity. There's so much to read, and there's so many people to look at, and there's such a uniqueness to this area of history, but at the same time, it's so frustrating to read. Like, well, tell me what you think about justification. You can't get this clarity that you want so bad to have a conclusive explanation of where these guys were. So happy studying, and thanks for listening.